5 separate recording sessions, over 5.5 hours of recorded content, 7 days of editing, some technical difficulties, but it all comes together for one milestone episode, number 100. We also have some extra content we are opening free to the public over on Patreon. In this episode, we are talking about the movie Braveheart, and over there on Patreon, Katie and I watch it on the big brown couch. Through Friday, May 16th, the Braveheart Watch Along is free to the public. We're also throwing in Outlaw King for free too, which is about another Scottish hero that we talk about heavily in this episode, and that is Robert the Bruce. Both of those movie reaction videos are free to the public on our Patreon only through Friday, May 16th, so make sure you check it out while we are celebrating our 100 episodes. There is a link in the show notes for you that you can click on to go directly there, or you can go to patreon.com/High Tales of History. And with that, let's get on with the show.
Hello and welcome to High Tales of History, a history podcast where two sisters get high and take a hazy adventure through history. I'm Laurel, the older sister.
Obviously, I'm Katie, the younger sister.
Guess who's back? Back again. We've got Dr. Darren Reid back guesting with us for a special episode 100. I'm so excited. Dr. Reid, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks for having me.
Everyone, if you've not met Dr. Reid before, he is an associate professor of history at Coventry University in Coventry, England. He's been on with us a couple of times. The very first time you came on, we did something kind of similar to what we'll be doing today. We're talking about Indigenous representation in various movies. We had a chat through a bunch of different things from Indiana Jones to Black Panther's Wakanda Forever to Dances with Wolves. That was Katie's absolute favorite movie. She loves it. She loves it so much. It's so fun for her to sit there for 3 hours and watch that. Well, it's so great having you for episode 100 because this is quite the celebration. In June 2021, Katie and I started High Tales of History, and we will be approaching 4 years in June. It's really fun. We've had 13 guests, folks. We've had 13 different guests. Now, some of them, like Darren, have been guests multiple times on this show, but we have had 13 different guests, 100 episodes, topics that have taken us at all points through time from, from some of like the beginnings of time up to the weird history of glitter and
you don't
disco.
know the crime that awoke in my soul, that episode.
We've been on so many continents in so many eras and time periods and different dynasties and civilizations and all these different places. And it's been such a fun quest to go on with you, Katie, and with all of our friends who have joined us on the show. It's one of my favorite things I've ever done. We've got 100 episodes today and hopefully hundreds more in the future. So thank you all for being here with us on this journey. Before I get too sappy, what are we all drinking today, everybody? We'll start guests first.
I've got a strawberry and lime cider, which I'm going to crack open now. I will warn you, I am not a famous drinker, so if my accent becomes thicker or I start speaking so fast it's illegible, you need to call me on that, because the more I drink, the more that will happen.
I've had exactly that same cider before, and it is quite good. It's like
that sounds
like fizzy
actually
juice.
Super bougie.
It is a bit.
How about you, Katie?
I have 2 shots of espresso in here. Yep. And I made myself a white mocha. I think it's actually technically more of a latte because I just, did the whole foamed milk with the espresso thing. So technically it's a white chocolate mocha latte, which is just way too arrogant of a mouthful. So I've got coffee, and I've got strong coffee, and I've got lots of coffee to approach the day with some semblance of motivation.
I feel like you just called me bourgeois whilst drinking a white chocolate mocha chino. Is that what it was?
White chocolate mocha latte.
I'm sorry. Have you a side of olives with that? Perhaps some feta cheese?
If only. I need my my shortbread is what I need in here.
Can't miss with some good old Scottish shortbread, which is
Oh, it touches
fantastic.
the soul. It's so buttery.
I also am joining you on the coffee train, choo choo. So, with the time difference between our recordings today with Darren and us, we are recording on Sunday morning. So, I went outside. I had a little wake and bake. I smoked a little joint, just a little, just a bit, and then I made myself a coffee. So, I am, I've waked, I have baked. Speaking of Scottish shortbread, as Katie just brought up, we are having a foray into Scottish history today.
What a segue.
Woo, woo, woo. Yeah. I like how I try to just force the segue to happen. Like we are.
Well, they are shortbread.
Right.
They are from Scotland, and we are going to Scotland. So
We are going to Scotland. Katie,
oh boy,
I've got accoutrement for the show today. Here it goes. It's going to come into screen
it's
because
not
it's so
sharp
long.
though. Yeah,
it's not sharp. Just a little plastic, little fake sword from the Halloween store
within the household.
There we go. And I've got a scarf. This is my winter scarf. But then I thought I'm just going to cosplay, guys. Don't worry about it. Here we go. Oh, the bagpipes. They are a playing. And with that, I'm ready to talk about.
I don't think I own any plaid.
See how I did that? Look at this.
Well, that's something we'll have to change, isn't it?
I was going to say, I feel a little bit ashamed.
And for our special episode 100, we have a movie reaction to Braveheart. One of the big famous Hollywood historical movies. Wouldn't you say? I feel like Braveheart's always one of the first ones that gets yelled out. You're like, what's one of your favorite historical movies? And people are like, oh, Saving Private Ryan. Gladiator. Oh, that's a good one. Yep. Braveheart. Yes, Braveheart's always on there as well, too. So what we'll be doing for our episodes, we're going to go through about scene by scene. We're going to go through the movie. If you are one of our Patreon members, you can do a watch along with Katie and I from the Big Brown Couch. So that movie is up for you now, and you can do like a watch along with us. We have our THC drinks. We've got our tea. We've got our shortbread. We've got a whole lot of sass and giggles and fun and a whole lot of good times that we had with it. So we could go over to the Best Buds Club and watch it along with us. Honestly, like right away, I had a name for this episode even before I had like the full concept of what I wanted to fully do in it. Bravehearts, be free tonight. Bravehearts, be free tonight. Katie, you got that one?
That one might have been a little over my head.
Rod Stewart? No, that's okay. We were replacing the words anyway. Young hearts be free tonight to Bravehearts be free tonight. Because we're talking about Bravehearts. Yes. But we're talking about the big picture of Scottish independence and what that has looked like historically, which is really what Braveheart is centered around, the story of William Wallace and the fight for Scottish independence. We're going to go through that. We're going to do a little scene by scene with Dr. Reid, who's going to be talking about, what's accurate in this movie or in this scene and maybe what's not so accurate, and talk about the real history here and have a whole lot of fun as we do it. So with that, I'm going to take my sword, and just like all these men in this movie, especially William Wallace himself, he takes his sword and he's always jabbing it into the ground. So that is going to be our starting moment. I'm going to go, and that's how we're starting.
Yeah,
Braveheart.
Yeah, as you dull your blade, and the trueness of the blade is then, I mean, if it's well made, it shouldn't have a problem. But still, I don't think their additions of carbon and their smithing techniques were probably as advanced as we have now. So
it's just so many disappointment on your face when Laurel threatened to shove that blade into the ground. It was palpable.
It's it's a dishonor to the memory of William Wallace, who I highly doubt, as like good of a thinker as this guy was, there is no fucking way he's gonna go think right into the ground. Not gonna happen. So yes, I watch this any day over Dances with Wolves, though. I mean, I love Braveheart. Like, it's good shit. But yeah, the sword sticking into the ground, it's gotta go. It's gotta go. Like, to the point where someone should go edit it out.
It happens no less than 7 times in the movie. So we'll point those all out for you, Katie. And if I can,
Thank you.
hopefully I can edit those moments in whenever we talk about them, so you can just visually
Hope
see
so.
each one that gets shoved into the ground. Braveheart, beautiful movie. It's directed by Mel Gibson, starring Mel Gibson, Sophie Marceau. We've got
Wait, he directed it?
mm-hmm,
What?
yeah.
I never knew that.
Yeah, quite the cast. It's one of those movies where you see each of the characters as they come up, different characters and the actors, and you're like, oh, I recognize him. I recognize him. Brendan Gleeson is in it as his best bud Hamish. Visually, beautiful movie. Does it have some historical inaccuracies and misrepresentations? Yeah, it does sometimes. But what's the general vibe? What's the love meter in Scotland on Braveheart, Darren?
Well, let me just tell you about how historians see it. I just typed in the phrase historical inaccuracies into Google, and the first thing that came up was an AI summary with a picture of Braveheart. So that's one thing. Amongst historians, it's generally seen as an adaptation of Blind Harry's kind of epic poem about the life of William Wallace, which was written 100 years after he died. It includes a lot of fanciful, shall we say, perspectives. But for people of Scotland, I remember when this movie came out, and it was such a big deal. I remember sitting in my best friend's parents' house. They had friends round, and it was like such a big thing. We all watched it together. And when I tell you, people were shouting, they were screaming, they were angry, they were upset at the TV. Like, this is a movie, we all see at some point growing up. We all learn about this part of history. This is a really important touchstone for us.
Interesting. Well, I'm looking forward to going through this movie and maybe seeing those moments where people might have been upset or shouting or cheering along with what's going on screen. But I guess the best place to start is at the beginning.
The beginning.
Spark it up, fill up your cup, and throw your hands up. We're gonna get started with Braveheart.
All right, so the film opens with Robert the Bruce narrating a very, very poor version of the history that led up to this point. And we get the Scottish nobles being betrayed. Little baby William Wallace is introduced with an inexplicable mullet and a caveman outfit, which I really want to hear you guys' thoughts on, by the way. And he sees the bodies hanging and he's traumatized. So my first question is to both of you. What did you guys think of the opening of the film?
It took me a while, when you talk about the caveman part of it, it took me a little while into the movie for me to be like, yeah, they really played this up, because at one point, Katie even pointed out on the big brown couch, she was like, I think that's a whole squirrel tied into that person's hair. And I was like,
Oh,
you sure
yeah.
it's not
I
just
was
like a bit of
"What the
fur?
fuck?"
So it was something I didn't notice until a little bit later on in the movie, that there's a vast difference between what the various people look like in this movie.
I mean, like, this is just the impression you're given, that they're like lowly, like dumb peasants, just like living like you said, like in like squalor and poverty. Because like the thing I noticed the most about William, and this might just be like a weird thing to say, but like he was really dirty. And I remember, like, you can like get dirty throughout the day and then clean up, but like I just felt like he was very inexplicably dirty, and I was like, that's kind of weird. I kind of think he probably wouldn't just be dirty for no reason, like unless you've gone and done some work. But yeah, I always thought that was kind of odd. I was like, okay.
It's one of the great stereotypes of the medieval period is that poor people are just, excuse me, constantly filthy.
Yeah.
And they probably bathed fairly regularly, probably took quite a lot of pride in their appearance as
Right?
well. I mean, you definitely see this medieval peasants are always depicted as filthy. And I mean, they kind of would have been relative to our standards, but I mean, they're not just filthy. I mean, their hair's matted, bits of animal tied to them.
Yeah.
And yeah, so one little thing, we'll just talk about the costuming. Everything's really dull. The medieval period would have been defined by really, really, really vibrant colours, which is something almost all productions get wrong. It would have been garishly vibrant to modernise, in fact.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Fashion in the
Interesting.
medieval period was bright, bright colours.
So it was gaudy as hell.
Lots of yellows, lots of bright greens and things like this. And they weren't like greens that would camouflage you into the wilderness. Like these are greens where you're like, oh, there's a guy. He's dressed in green, all right.
There's a guy in green.
Right, yeah, for sure. No, that's not the kind of green. That's like your green screen kind of shade. Yeah, that's really, really common in most Hollywood depictions of the medieval times. You make them dirty, and you make them the colours dull. The part of the dirt comes from the Victorians, because the Victorians love to depict medieval people as really backwards and really barbarian-like and really filthy, and they did that to make themselves look even better. So you guys have probably heard, for example, that Columbus sailed the ocean and people thought he was going to fall off the edge of the world. Mm-hmm. Absolutely not true. No one in 1492 thought the world was flat. No one thought the world was flat probably for thousands of years, in fact, if they even ever thought the world was flat. We know this for a fact. We've got Greek philosophers talking about the shape of the world. Columbus himself thought the world was roundish, more like pear-shaped, but what's a pear between friends?
Still goes around.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's round in one part at least.
Throw it down a hill, it's going to roll. Round enough for me.
and we know that sailors at that time used a sextant, which is a navigational instrument that entirely relies upon the assumption, the knowledge that the Earth is curved. But the Victorians, especially encyclopedia writers, essentially started a conspiracy to paint peoples, even Europeans from the past, as much less intelligent, much less accomplished than they were, so that they shone all the brighter.
Good try. Failure. Victorians.
Okay, so the scene goes on, right? Wallace is taken into a hut where a bunch of Scottish nobles are hanging, and he's traumatized by the whole affair, right? So that my historian bone kicks in here. I have to correct something. Didn't happen. William Wallace was born about 1280, just 6 years before the succession crisis that would lead to the Wars of Independence. So the Wars of Independence don't start till the 1290s. This depiction just didn't happen at all. It's the invention of someone called Blind Harry, who was a 15th century writer, basically lived about 100 years after Wallace died. And that's when he wrote this epic poem, which this movie is largely based upon. Now, a lot of what Blind Harry says is verified in other sources, right? We know there's historical truth to it, but there's also an awful lot of nonsense in it as well, because medieval writers loved to exaggerate. In fact, one of the hallmarks of medieval literature is how much can you exaggerate, and how can you take an existing tale and then really blow it up. So this scene where the Scottish nobles are hanging is a complete fiction. Do you guys know the story of how the Scottish Wars of Independence came to be?
Yeah, I don't think the nobles were all killed. They were just kind of like bent to the will of Edward the First, right? Like, didn't he come in and was like,
figureheads?
Yeah, that sort of stuff.
Why did Edward the First come in? Do you know?
He's an asshole. I mean, whatever his ambition is, it's not a good reason. So he's just obviously an asshole.
So what happens, right? In 1286, the Scottish king, Alexander III, was riding fast one night in order to get to his lady wife. And either his horse went over, or he was thrown off over a cliff, or he was thrown off his horse. Either way, Alexander III is out of the picture. Unfortunately for Alexander, all of his children predeceased him. All his children died. He had one grandchild. So this is 1286, Alexander III is killed. He has one grandchild who, I think it was Margaret, the Maid of Norway. And she's very young. But in 1290, the Scottish nobles send for her. They essentially form a council in the interim. And in 1290, when she's old enough, they send for her. And she dies on the crossing from Norway to Scotland. And that's what definitively triggers the succession crisis.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So at this point, all of the different, well, not all of them, but many of the Scottish noble families have competing claims to the kingdom, the kingship. And because the country is sort of edging towards civil war, the council or the nobles ultimately decide to ask Edward I of England to serve as arbiter. And he agrees on one condition, which is the Scottish nobles recognise him as the overlord of the whole British Isles. Now,
There it is.
this isn't entirely a new idea. You can go back like to King Canute in the very beginning of the 11th century, for
There he is.
example. And even before that, you'll find examples of the different kingdoms of the British Isles, which are very fluid at that time, recognizing, an overlord. But I mean, it didn't really mean anything. It was just, okay, you've got the biggest kingdom. Good for you. But that was it. So the Scottish nobles recognise this. It's not that big of a deal, except Edward I is planning a takeover of Scotland, like a genuine takeover. So what he does is, as this process goes on between 1291 and 1292, this is called the Great Cause. Two families have the most serious claim to the kingship. Those are the Balliols and the Bruces, right? Yes, those Bruces. And Edward I selects John Balliol, King John, to become the next King of Scotland, in part because he's really weak and really, really ineffective. And over the next few years, Edward I imposes himself on Scottish political life in a really big and heavy way, including overturning decrees and laws passed by King John. And when King John goes to complain to the English court, go to the other king and say, hey, look, you're overstepping here. Edward I made King John enter the court as a common plaintiff, not as another monarch, just as any other lord, to come and make a complaint to the court. And eventually, around about 1295, this is when John finally does something, and he renounces his fealty to England, and England invades, and King John is swiftly captured, deposed, and becomes a prisoner. And it's at this point the physical conquest, rather than the political conquest of Scotland, begins. So this is a good few years after this scene. The Scottish nobles aren't hanged. In fact, on the contrary, what Edward I does, what any good medieval monarch does, which is try to win the nobles over to your cause.
Come on in, buddies. It's fine. We're all friends together. You're gonna have a good time with me as your best mate down in London.
Do you trust him though? I don't.
I don't think there's a lot of trust for Edward I amongst many of the nobles, but he does something really clever, which is he gives a lot of the nobles lands in England as well, like the British.
Wow.
So they have estates in the north of England, and that means that they have to declare fealty to him in order to continue to control and own those very profitable estates that give him a lot more money and power. So in a sense, he tries to turn them less into Scottish nobles and more into nobles of the British Isles. You have a vested interest in his kingship, or rather overlordship. This is really important. Edward I never claims to be King of Scotland, just overlord. So he never physically claims the Scottish crown. He doesn't need it.
Yeah.
He's happy enough just suppressing the peasantry and the nobility. That was like a really fun day for him.
And feel good about himself.
Exactly.
Boo! You suck. That's me from the back of the room. I think you're a big dumb idiot with long legs, and I think you're stupid. Go home. That's me. That was me in the back. Sorry, it's the tartan, guys. It's the tartan that does it to me. It pulls out my.
I mean, nobody likes a bully, and when you go back into this time in history, you see a lot of it. So you're like, this is some shit. There's a lot of it.
Well, let me tell you, when I first saw this movie, even this opening scene had people really, really angry. So, from a storytelling perspective, it works really, really well. It sets the stakes up. It's fun, but it's just a fairy tale. None of this happened. Wallace wasn't radicalized as a child. The Scottish nobility weren't slaughtered. They sort of had their own greed used against them, the fact that none of them could decide on who was going to be king. And that's something we see. And this war doesn't end really until 1328. I mean, it kind of ends in 1314, but it's not officially ended until 1328. So this is much longer than a generation. This conflict lasts, and that's eventually when you end up with one of the Bruces on the throne. So it was Robert the Bruce who was against John Balliol for the kingship, but not the Robert the Bruce. It was his granddad. So the granddad of the future king.
Okay.
So then William Wallace wants to go to war with his dad, He almost certainly didn't go to war against the English because, like I said, all of this is made up, but it shows us a little bit about the young heart of this young caveman, mulleted fellow. And his dad returns dead at English hands. Again, more radicalization of Wallace at the young age. Almost certainly didn't happen again. It's a wonderful piece of storytelling, but as a piece of history, it's pretty much entirely nonsense. We get the introduction of Brian Cox's Argyle.
Thank you. I was just leaning in like, Doc, can we really make sure that we talk about how badass Brian Cox looks?
Well, Brian Cox is from the town I did all my degrees in, which is 20 miles from my birthplace. So we have a great affinity for Brian Cox. Back when I used to work in an independent cinema, and he was best known for being the original Hannibal Lecter that no one saw, we were still proud of Brian Cox. So it was great to see him in this film. What's great as well was the difference in accents. Little baby William Wallace speaks with the broadest little West Coast Glaswegian accent I've ever heard. Brian Cox with a much more northeasterly, deeper, sinuous voice, which I'm also appreciative of.
Yeah, he's kind of like the slightly hot and like mysterious uncle that like comes riding in. His name's Argyle, which is really cool. Mysterious, well-traveled. He is multilingual and has like this like badass scar over his face. You're like, ooh, where'd you get that? Where'd you get that? What's up, Argyle? What's up, Katie?
Is that Mad Eye Moody?
No.
Which one is this?
Have you seen X-Men 2? The guy who created Wolverine.
Oh,
he's the bad guy in X-Men 2.
Yeah,
He's been in so many things.
Super Troopers. That's what
yeah,
it is.
For sure. Yeah, so Argyle is the Latin-speaking noble uncle of William Wallace. Which is actually really good, actually, that they talk about him learning Latin. William Wallace was the son of a minor noble. He wasn't a peasant, like he's depicted in this movie, but he probably wasn't from wealth either. The nobility in any country in Europe at this time would have had much more in common with each other than they would have had the common people of their own countries. Many of them might have gone to Rome, for example, in their youth, visited the papacy. They would have learned Latin. That would have been the lingua franca of the day. At least most people would speak some form of Latin at some point in their lives. That was the language of diplomatic communication. And in fact, the Declaration of Arbroath, which is the Declaration of Independence Scotland issued at the end, almost at the end of this whole process in 1320, that was written in Latin as well. And Arbroath is also the town where I'm from.
Hooray!
But it's not in Gaelic?
Nope.
Doesn't that seem like somehow incorrect?
No, because Gaelic was the language of the Highlands, not the language of Scotland. So Gaelic is spoken in the Highlands and the Islands, but in the Lowlands they speak a dialect of English called Scots, which would have been much thicker than you hear in this movie. My granddad, when I was much younger, would speak in such a thick accent that most people who spoke the same language as him couldn't understand what he was saying. And it's not just the accent, it's not just the sounds you make, it's the words. So it depends where you are. If you're in the Highlands, maybe Gaelic. But the language of diplomacy, of official communication is Latin, because we're still living in a post-Roman world.
That's true.
Yeah, the legacy of the Roman Empire.
You can't forget Rome. They're just everywhere, just popping up. Mm-hmm. Rain on everyone's fucking parade. Sorry.
Well, Rome's not around at this point, but Rome remains incredibly powerful because it's the centre of Christendom. Because in a lot of ways, the Roman Empire didn't collapse, it just transformed and splintered. Mm-hmm. One of its successor organisations, probably its most important, is the Catholic Church.
There it is, yep.
Don't we know it?
Absolutely. And also the Declaration of Arbroath was literally written to the Pope. But we can talk about, we're jumping ahead in the chronology here. We're jumping ahead. That's the end of the movie. And let me tell you, someone from Arbroath, I'm really freaking disgusted that whenever they make these movies, and I'm looking at you, Outlaw King, that you never show my bloody town and celebrate its role as the literal birthplace of Scottish independence. So if any Hollywood producers are listening to this, rectify that now. We're getting pissed.
Hang on, where's my sword? Where is
your sword?
There we go.
The sword. I've got a blow. I
Well,
do. I haven't. Well, I knew Laura was bringing a sword. I don't have a sword, but I've got an indigenous blow dart from my last trip to
That
Brazil.
that functions. That checks out.
I
I've
feel like
got a
it's
bow. I've got a bow.
I feel like we're ready to raid someplace.
So we're gonna go get
Absolutely.
some cars and go kick ass. Let's go. Plastic sword. Literally, you guys are gonna be so much more effective.
Yes, we would.
We're
just
going to be
gonna-
effective. I've got a blow dart, and the dart is blunt. It's literally, there's no point to it. So I'm not sure I'll be more effective shooting a tiny, weak piece of wood at my enemies than I would be just
Am I
running.
the only one with real arrows?
I think you might be.
But I feel like, Darren, yours definitely has a different element of surprise, and people will be so taken back by like, have I just been hit by a blow dart? Like, what's just happened? Am I poisoned? Am I gonna like that?
If I shout at them, you've got 10 minutes to get the antidote. Right, then
That's how
maybe then. Yeah.
Psychological warfare.
Exactly. Like the Battle of Stirling Bridge, I would have outmaneuvered my enemies. But we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Oh,
We're
yes.
still in the thick of
Away.
this. And I have a question for you guys.
Yes.
We are introduced to young William Wallace's bride-to-be. What did you guys think of the love story in this movie?
Goodness, she's so lovely. Well, you know what? I feel like these sorts of movies, especially where there's like this romantic, not like romantic love, but like there's a romanticism about it, that when you add a love story and a love interest, it adds to the emotional stakes of it all, right?
You
And
have to.
yeah. So not
It's
only
the one thing that no matter where you come from, any human can connect to it. That's the point.
Yeah, exactly. So you're like this fight for freedom and David and Goliath sort of thing going on here, but then you also add in this beautiful, passionate love story that happened from when there were little nuggets here, like they being in the same village or area that they lived together, and then having this meeting and always
And their tits. Sorry.
Watching that scene with my friend's parents was awkward.
Oh yeah.
Like, where do I look? Where do I look right now?
You're like,
Everyone in the room was silent.
That's a really interesting bit on the carpet there. I don't know if I've ever really noticed that pattern on the carpet before like that. Is it over? I'm feeling really hot in my face right now.
Rude,
Oh, it's still going.
There.
Yeah.
I was a teenage boy at the time. Like, my eyes were just like pinged open. I couldn't drag it was like being stared at by Medusa. I couldn't tear my eyes away even if I tried at that point.
I forgot that was even a thing until you and I watched it, Laurel. I think that's the first time I think I said that. Like, the first time I've ever watched Braveheart not on, like, TV.
Uh-huh.
I don't think I've ever seen, like, the parts without all that cut out of it. And I was like, there are boobies? This is great. I was immediately...
Boobs, penis, and ass.
Yeah, we get all of it.
There are cock and balls in there, people. I didn't know that. And I was like, what? Their dicks are out. And Laurel's like, yeah, have you never seen? I was like, I've never seen this in my life.
I'll be honest with you, as soon as that scene was shown and as soon as the first people in Scotland saw it, we were like, oh, yeah, we're owning this now.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you don't tend to wear underwear when you wear a kilt anyway. Luckily for you guys, my kilt's in Scotland, so I'm not wearing any. I can't demonstrate.
Happy episode 100.
For the $7 a month tier, I'm just gonna be a surprise. You need to sign up for it and stay subscribed for a year to help these two lovely ladies out. But
there we go.
Absolutely. That's my price.
It's just a Scotsman's kilt calendar that gets sent out.
The most disappointing. If you want to do a sequel to this, we can watch The Outlaw King, which has not just cock and balls, but specifically Chris Pine's cock and balls.
Oh, yeah.
Do they have their own eyebrows as well?
It's very good. I didn't look that closely. I hope my children never hear this.
For their sake, I hope not.
Oh.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
So as Laura was saying, it's a really beautiful love story that really moves the human heart. And as Katie recognised that well, and of course, how does Wallace demonstrate his love to the young Marion? He gives her a thistle.
Oh, hang on, guys. I've got more props. Hang on.
This better not be related to cock and balls.
No, but it is related to thistle.
No.
Ah,
There. So if you're watching, you can see a dried thistle.
nice.
Yeah. And so this is it's actually like considered, if I'm not mistaken, here I am like the American telling the Scot about their country.
We love this thistle.
This
Americans explain Scotland.
But this is like considered like a national symbol of Scotland.
Yeah,
Like
it's
the
a
thistle
national
is
flower.
like, this is like a big.
You know, that was the only flower I've ever been compared to in my life is the thistle,
It's actually a
specifically.
beautiful flower.
Yeah, it's
Oh, thank you.
purple.
The person saying it was making the point that I'm tough and thorny.
12 minutes and 44 seconds. Uncle Argyle, Obi-Wan Kenobi's the shit out of William Wallace, teaches him Latin, takes him away, he returns. He sees his bride. There's no explanation for why he returns or why he was taken away by a noble uncle and not given any wealth or means to support himself. He comes
Right.
back, meets his ghost dad, who tells him to follow a free heart. And then we get a really interesting shot, which is the bagpipers playing at Wallace's father's funeral. And when Wallace asks his Uncle Argyle what they're saying, he says they're playing outlawed tunes on outlawed pipes, which was a real thing in the 18th century, not in the 13th.
Oh.
So, dear historians, dear history fans, one of the things that what Braveheart does is collapse together lots of different eras of Scottish history all into one. And I'm going to talk about one in particular later on, but this is a reference to the Jacobite Rebellion, when the bagpipes and indeed tartan and kilts were indeed banned by the British state following the last Jacobite uprising. But after that, Scotland became the new black in the UK. He's given his first sword and he's told, before I'm going to teach you how to wield this, I'm going to teach you how to use this, which is one of the themes of the movie, which is about outsmarting your enemy. And so brings us to a close of the introduction or prelude of Braveheart.
I was glad that they at least didn't make William Wallace out to be like lucky or like out of nowhere intelligent. Like, I'm glad that they were like, nah, he's educated, dog. And it's like, thank you for at least giving us that.
Okay. I don't know if now's the time to tell you this, right? But Wallace in this movie is kind of an amalgamation of two different people. So there's
I think I've been told this before, but you're obviously going to give me the full details on it because I can't say I fully remember. But I remember somebody saying something like they do the same thing in Game of Thrones. There's a lot of written characters that aren't there. They kind of mash them into one and shove them in the TV show. Kind of the same idea, except this is real historical people.
So William Wallace was real and didn't do all the things that are in this movie, but he was a real person. But another person who was also real was Andrew de Moray. And he was the mastermind behind Stirling Bridge, which we will come to later.
And after William Wallace has been set up here and we're establishing his character, it bounces back in the next scene back to old Longshanks himself, Edward I, and his boy Edward II. Yeah, he's marrying like the most beautiful woman you're ever going to see in your life. Actor's name is Sophie Marceau. She's a French princess. Her name is Isabella. He's marrying her. It's weird. Edward II is always written as a character kind of like this in some way, where he's weak or ineffective or kind of a brat, or he's in this one he seems to be written as maybe he's gay or just like more into anything else other than like warfare and what his dad's doing, or a patron of the arts. Like there's always this sort of certain way that Edward II gets written in movies and TV shows. But here he is, giving his beautiful bride a little boop on the cheek, a little peck, and then cuts to Edward I talking about what's going on in Scotland and ways to coax. As you mentioned further, there's this sort of like integrating of Scotland and England nobles, and hey, we'll give them lands here, and we'll give these guys lands there, and we're going to do this thing, and we're going to tie it together more, and let's add in prima nocta. What? So we had to talk about this on the Big Brown Couch, Doc, and you can, of course, either confirm, deny, clear and dispel up any sort of myths that we have here. But the envelope that we had, this is my notes, that I made from the movie of our historical inaccuracies. And I have written on there that they use this in the movie, and it's kind of like I mean, of so many different straws on the proverbial camel's back. This is the one that they're going to really kind of focus on in this movie and be like, we're going to introduce prima nocta, which means that English lords up in Scotland, if there is a wedding or whatever, you know, a new union of the Scots, the English lord has the right to then take the bride on her wedding night. Gross, disgusting, angering, makes your blood boil, makes you so mad. I have it on my envelope that that's not really a thing that happened, but especially in general, but especially not in this time period. That was not something that was announced. What do you have to say about that?
It's utter nonsense.
Ah, there we go. Yes, envelope. You did it. You did it, envelope.
The envelope's doing good work. Yeah, no, it's completely nonsense. It's just a story device. It's very silly. And it's also actually kind of completely unnecessary. I mean, you know, Wallace's wife gets killed. You know, lots of bad things are happening, actual bad things. And it makes the blood boil for good reason, because it's a horrible, horrible concept, but it's also quite unnecessary. I think that's my biggest problem in the movie, actually, other than like the historical stuff, is the way it treats sexuality. So you talk about Edward II, who's depicted clearly as gay, and that being a bad thing. The movie's a little bit homophobic. He's very effeminate. He's everything his dad isn't. He's weak. He's ineffectual. He's effeminate. He lacks martial discipline or ability. And actually, Edward II wasn't. You know, he had some ability in those areas. Probably a lot of this comes from the fact that he was deposed by his own queen in favour of their son, Edward III. So, you know, in some respects, he certainly wasn't an effective monarch. But there again, if we were to judge all monarchs based on their ability to not be hung or betrayed by their own nobles, it would be a relatively small list. See, Mary, Queen of Scots, for example. So, very unfair depiction of him, and a very strange use of sexual assault just to make the blood boil. Makes my blood boil. I don't know how you ladies feel about it, but I'm not wickedly happy that was included as a story point.
Yeah.
I mean, especially if it's just not accurate. It's just kind of like, it's one of those things that when you add things, I'm like, man, again, yes, it had a point, but like you said, there's plenty of real bad stuff to talk about. You didn't need to put something that wasn't real.
Yeah.
It kind of, I think the greatly upsetting part is it takes away from all the original reasons that everybody went to war in the first place. So it's kind of like, I mean, if you're going to tell the story, at least do it justice kind of thing. So yeah, I get why that would definitely upset people. You'd be like, well, that's fucking bollocks. And another thing.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I really do. Then the movie goes on. We're introduced to Robert the Bruce in person this time, and his leprosy-riddled father. That wasn't a word, by the way. I literally made that up on the spot. I've drunk this entire cider, so I might start, as a Scotsman's prerogative, just abusing the language to my personal needs. But
always sticking it to the English.
Yeah.
Even in their own language.
I'm having a great time, though.
Us too.
Yeah. So Wallace, the Bruce's father, is also creepy and weird and riddled with leprosy, and we understand something's wrong from the start.
He's always
Robert
bandaged.
Bruce,
What the fuck was that about?
Yeah.
He doesn't get the bandages till later. He just sort of creeps around the castle.
Yeah, he does. Yeah.
But Robert the Bruce has really done a bit of a disservice here. Very weak and ineffective, at least for most of or big chunks of the movie. But he's introduced, and then we go on to the love story. So the next scene after Robert the Bruce and his weird father are introduced, for which I don't think there's any evidence he was suffered from leprosy. Adult William Wallace, we have now finally meet Mel Gibson at 20 minutes into the movie, returns home to find rubble and memories. He goes to a party, there's a big celebration going on. He meets the adult version of the woman who will come his life, and the love story continues with lots of longing looks and, of course, a test of manhood when he reacquaints himself with Hamish, his boyhood friend, and throws rocks again for some reason. I actually really like that scene because it's entirely David and Goliath. Hamish is able to throw a much bigger rock much further, and therefore is the greater man. But he can't hit William Wallace with a big rock because it's inaccurate. So Wallace picks up a wee stone, hurls it, and smacks him in the middle of the head. What a great summary of this movie's main theme. So use your head. And then at the end of that scene, we get to the arrival of the local English lord who functionally kidnaps and sexually assaults the bride. The part is a wedding celebration, and it's probably the most horrifying moment in the film. So, ladies, I'll let you take this one.
Yuck.
Yeah, I was going to say, it'll just be an outpouring of my negativity towards that imagery.
Straight up yuck. We are in the midst of this wonderful party, and there's so much joy and just excitement going on. And then they ride in, and then you just go, oh no, what's going to happen here? And it's the worst kind of thing. You know, something that was mentioned was this use of prima nocta. And I know we were just talking about it a moment ago. It was just being like like a red shirt or the bloody shirt, you know, like symbolizing probably all these moments in this long history of
oppression,
rape and murder and oppression and theft. But this is how it's going to kind of get shown in these sort of moments like this to like really acutely make your blood boil. And then after that, it's like really like just all the air's been let out of everything. It should have been a joyous day. And then it starts to rain, and it's raining sideways. And it's
the
just,
rain is like the poetic part. And this is when it gets on that beautifully Spanish bred horse and starts trotting around all majestically.
Yeah, and where does he go, Katie? On his
beautiful
horse
he
in the rain.
Where his heart carries him.
And his heart leads him to Myrrh.
Yeah, there you go. It's to her doorstep to beg a date off of her father.
He wants to take his daughter out for a lovely ride in the Scottish countryside, and just to find in the fine Scottish rain and all this stuff, and it's lovely. And her parents say no, but Myrrh in her heart says yes, and she goes, "Oh, it's fine. I'm not gonna," and she just jumps on the back of this horse and rides away with William Wallace out into the hills, out into the greenery and the lushness. And somehow, in that next scene, as they're riding through this beautiful countryside, it stopped raining.
Right? What was that about?
The rain has stopped. The love is in full effect. And there we go. And then they have a beautiful little, so romantic, beautiful little moment as they sit together after their ride.
I thought the banter between them in that moment was really, really lovely. Really sweet.
She's got jokes. She's beautiful and she's got jokes. I love it.
Yeah, she's a really strong character. I like that she can't read. And then he says, "Oh, that's something we should have to remedy. What language?" And he's just showing off how many languages he can speak at this point. Yeah, so really, really lovely.
But also prepared to teach her how to read, because he's about empowering women. So I'm just going to throw that out there for him.
So this movie does both, though, right? Because it uses female sexuality or women's sexuality as a cudgel to reinforce masculinity. So you go back to the prima nocta scene. And, the thing that makes your blood boil is that women are being sexually assaulted. And that's a really common trope in Western literature and film and things like this, where it's a man's job to essentially protect women from, the worst of men. And you can go right back to the birth of cinema and watch something like The Birth of a Nation, where white chastity, white sexuality is really controlled and policed. So yes, this movie is interested, or at least Wallace in this movie is interested in empowering women. But, big but, the movie still uses women's sexuality as something that men have to protect or fight over or really have the power to dominate.
I mean, what year was this? 93?
5.
Yeah, 95.
Yeah, well, and then we also get a little bit of kilt jokes too, which is fun. Everyone loves a kilt joke. She said, "I'd be more impressed if you did that if you said that standing on your head or something like that." And he's like, "Well, I could, but my kilt will fly up." And she's like, "Ah!" Like, oh my gosh, they didn't either. No manners when you were on your world travels. But
do you know why she's so shocked?
Because kilts didn't exist. She's like, "What the fuck is a kilt?"
Exactly. Why are you dressed like a caveman and and a Scot from the 17th century?
Yeah.
Or a Highlander, not even a Scot. Yeah. So absolutely. So the big elephant in the room that I've let ride with us so far is that no Scots weren't wearing kilts at this time. We don't really know when the kilt came into fashion. It was Highland dress, not Lowland, and it was probably 16th, 17th century. In the sort of the modern image of it and its celebration and its adoption as a national dress is a 19th century phenomenon.
I feel like that's
Looks
probably the
good.
most disappointing piece of Scottish information anyone has ever received. Just because, like, I mean, as an American, that's the first thing you picture is bagpipes and a kilt, obviously.
Okay. What you have to remember is Scotland's was and always is a dynamic culture. It changes over time.
Mhm.
It was never set in stone. Just as like we go back to when we were talking about Native Americans in film and how we always want Native Americans to look one way.
Mhm.
But even if you went back 500 years before contact, they would have looked really different. They would have come from different societies pre-pandemics, right? Before they were 90% of the population. I mean, Native Americans suffered the biggest biological apocalypse in human history, right? They changed and they modernized constantly. And it's only because we've inherited a worldview where we kind of fetishize an imaginary version of people in the past that it's disappointing. And why do we want other cultures to remain static? And what does it matter if medieval Scots didn't wear kilts? They wore them in the early modern period. They wear them now. Like, just because Pictish people in, say, the 700s didn't wear them, why does that matter? And I don't mean that as like an offensive question, but like really to provoke, your thoughts on this.
Mhm.
Like, why do we need historic peoples, particularly ones who don't fit with the norm, so to speak, that are a little bit left of centre? Why do we want them to appear in one particular way rather than accept them for who they are? That's my question to you, ladies, and indeed any dear listeners who want to weigh in.
I think a lot of that has to
Yeah.
do, you said it pretty much right in the beginning, and I agree with that pretty much wholeheartedly, is that you want to fantasize everything. It's like that same thing with the like the knights in shining armor, like you said, but that whole idea that like chivalry and everything was alive then. And then when I look and tell people that Game of Thrones is a more accurate representation than any of the Hollywood stuff, people are like, what do you mean? I'm like, no, it was like really terrible back then, dude. Like people were trying to outdo each other in creative ways to like horrifically kill each other. Like that's a more accurate representation than like Heath Ledger, as dashing as he is, on in A Knight's Tale, which is so historically inaccurate, but it is fun and it makes my heart happy when I watch it. But yeah, like you said, that whole fantasizing of the past, I think, has a lot to do with it. Like, yeah, makes it easier for people to digest, perhaps, is the way to put that.
Mm-hmm. So, as you said, in the next part, they go on the first date. Fine Scottish weather, the rain's falling down a little bit sideways. That's very true. That's what the weather's like frequently in the winter, I'm afraid to say. And William Wallace is specifically not interested in rebellion. Despite all he's seen up to this point, he is not interested in fighting. He is an incredibly romantic figure. I love you. Always have. Will you marry me? He says. They have a secret marriage presided over by a priest, which wouldn't have always been necessary at this point in time. People didn't necessarily need to get married in a church or by a priest. Marriage was just something that just sort of happened when people assumed a relationship together. Then we have the gratuitous early 90s sex scene, and then the pair continue secretly going on about their lives. Then we encounter the gross Englishman, who is inexplicably reminded of his daughter when he speaks to Wallace's wife.
Oh
Yeah.
God, this
They
is
made
the
that
line that
so
makes me want to peel my skin off every time.
They made him so
Ugh.
gross on purpose, too.
He's so repulsive. He's cornered Myrrhen as she's trying to carry a basket of vegetables or whatever that she's carrying from one place to another. And it yep. And then he says, "You remind me of my daughter back home." And that's where I throw up in my mouth a little bit and I just want to peel off my skin suit and just walk away. I just want to nope. But unfortunately, yeah, in this scene, Murren is attacked and assaulted by this man, and thankfully William comes in and breaks apart a couple of the group standing
90s
near her,
masculinity trope.
and yeah, there he is. He jumps in, and this is where shit all really hits the fan, because he wasn't interested in rebellion before, but his wife, his lady love, she is attacked. He sends her off on a horse, says, "I will meet you in the grove, right? I will meet you in the forest nearby. Go, ride." And she's off. And he's like, okay, good. So he's knocking skulls. He's, getting these guys. He disguises himself in some English armor and colors, goes out to the grove. And this is where we have the first moment where he gets into the field, or into the grove, and he puts his sword in the ground. He's looking around for her, and he's like, where is she?
I want a sword counter in the corner of this podcast.
Okay, being one. This is the first time the sword is stuck in the ground. It's really quick.
To his
Just
credit,
boom, and he's
having
taken
a
off.
very emotionally charged moment, so I understand why that would be. But just lay it down, man, on the side.
A question for
Okay.
you both. Do you think William Wallace had a wife?
We don't know, do we? I mean, I think this gets used again as like a catalyst.
I'm gonna guess. Has anyone ever described William Wallace? Do we know what he looks like?
No idea what he looks like.
So we don't know if he's handsome or not. Well, then I don't know. I can't.
We know he was charismatic.
That's true. So probably. He was not incapable of wooing said maidens.
Sure. I mean, it's not that much of a stretch to imagine that he might have been married at some point. So, but the details of his wife come from Blind Harry again.
Yeah.
No idea if they're accurate. So in the movie, she's called Muriel. But in the poem, it does say that he had a wife and she was killed by the English, which was just what spurs the attack, which brings him to prominence, if you like. So one thing as historians we have to think about, right, is how do people get information? And if you go back to, let's say, the 15th or the 14th century, is all across Western Europe, you would have a much bigger emphasis on an oral culture. So people telling stories and traditions surviving. And usually, in my experience, oral cultures, oral histories, usually have a grain of truth in their heart, or a seed. Now, sometimes they sprout and go in all sorts of different directions, but it's not that big of a stretch to imagine that at some point in his life was possibly married, and that the death of his wife might have been an inciting factor of why he decided to do what he did.
Would it be out of place for his wife to have been killed by the English?
Possibly.
Okay, because it sounded like there wasn't a whole lot of I don't know. But it sounds like leading up to this, it didn't sound like a whole lot of physical altercation, because you said pretty much everything was done with diplomacy, and people were like, nope, I'm your overlord, and it's like, well, all right then. And then carrying it. So to me, I guess, so this is the person who has read medieval poetry and gets very frustrated by it very often, because it's very difficult to dig through. It's what are other historical documents at this time saying? Do they corroborate that? So to me, I'm like, is this corroborated by the fact that, yes, this isn't unheard of, or no, that's probably total bullshit?
Okay, I've got you now. Okay, so in 1296, which is around about the time this scene is happening, John Balliol has been deposed as the Scottish king. And his supporters, the people who fought against Edward I during that initial invasion, have largely been imprisoned. And amongst those, we return to the character of Andrew de Moray, right? So Andrew de Moray Sr. is imprisoned in London, and Andrew de Moray Jr., the one who, that's de Moray, that's who we're going to talk about going forward, he's imprisoned, I think, on the Welsh border. And he escapes, I think in 1296, maybe early 1297, and travels from the Welsh-English border all the way to the north of Scotland.
He couldn't be held, dude.
He couldn't be held. Right? And this is a guy who isn't even in this movie, right?
What?
So he gets to, try to think how to describe it. If
the plot has thickened.
Scotland's got a really big nose and a mohawk. Just where the nose and the mohawk meet, you're kind of in that area.
Yeah.
He gets all the way up there, a long journey as a fugitive, probably on foot for much of it.
Probably.
And there, so he lives in a region called Petty's Andrew de Moray of Petty, and he raises his banner in support of John Balliol. And he then begins to attack the English garrisons in that area. So after John Balliol's deposed as the Scottish king, so first of all, the violence of the actual conquest itself, then you've got most Scottish castles are controlled by English authorities at this point. and those English authorities are dispensing justice. So,
Okay.
and we can also imagine that occupying forces in that area as well might have committed some type of atrocities.
Right.
There wouldn't be massive occupying armies at this time because standing armies were incredibly expensive to run. What you'd instead have are local Scottish nobles who would swear fealty, and then it would be their forces that would police and control the area.
Mm-hmm.
So, but you've certainly got English authority and English families in control of most castles. They would have been dispensing justice. So no, it's not impossible, but we don't even know if William Wallace had a wife, let alone if that wife was killed. That being said, he was born in 1280. This scene would have taken place probably 1297 actually. So he would have been 27 years old, which is about the age that medieval men tended to marry.
There you go. Okay.
So, yeah, you might imagine that. Just for the record, I'm not convinced Mel Gibson's in his late 20s in this.
He's not. He's 39 years old.
Yeah,
I would have said early 30s. He actually doesn't look not doing too bad. Much like my sister, looks great for their age. So there you go.
Then we get that awful scene where the English lord, have we not learned to live together in relative peace and harmony before slitting the wife of the maybe fictional Marion/Murrow?
Boo. Once again, I'm in the back. I'm in the back of this going, you suck. We don't even want you here. Go away.
So the murder of Wallace's wife justifies everything that comes next, or all the other things, many of which are fictitious, as the audience's blood boil as Wallace finally arrives, ready to mace some bad guys in the face.
Oh, and doesn't he, though? Oh, my goodness.
Well, it's really interesting that he goes from like being an aggrieved husband to being a diehard, ideologically driven fighter who wants freedom for his country.
It does kind of like, unless we're just supposed to believe that he just spirals because he's like, well, if this will happen, it's going to keep happening and it's going to keep going and blah, 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 blah. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've never lived in the 13th century of Scotland. I can honestly tell you.
Next time I visit 13th century Scotland, I'll let you know. Scottish forces begin to launch Trojan horse-style attacks, guerrilla warfare against the English, which is again probably, well, it did happen, right? Like Wallace definitely like led attacks, but really the guerrilla warfare stuff is Andrew Murray again. So he is leading attacks, for example, on Urquhart Castle. If you've ever seen pictures of Loch Ness, Laurel, I know you've been to Loch Ness. If you ever see the castle on the shore, that's Urquhart Castle.
Okay, yeah.
You know, that's one of Moray's targets. He clears the local area of the English and begins to gather lots of local support. Whereas in the southwest of the country, Wallace is doing the same. So you've got two kind of independent rebellions happening at the same time. You've also ultimately going to end up having a rebellion of the nobles, which kind of stops before it even starts, which this movie covers. But for the time being, you've got these guerrilla attacks and Wallace declaring that the surviving English should run and tell their masters that Scotland is free. And it's this point we cut back to the English court, where we see Edward I learning of this rebellion. And I have to say, the actor, who I don't have his name written down, but the actor who plays Edward I is freaking magnificent.
Isn't he great? I'm so glad you like him too. I was like, he is such a good villain. I love his villainous. And then his his side eyebrow. Woof. So good.
He's ruthless. He's cold. I love to hate that character. He's absolutely fabulous. I absolutely adore him. Absolutely adore him. Character I adore less because of his portrayal as Edward II, who's depicted as out of touch and ineffectual, which is fine. But again, there's also the homophobia, I think, the sort of mid-90s casual homophobia that oozes from this, which I'm not a big fan of. Edward I backhands his son. It's really sore. One day you'll be a king, at least try to act like it, he says. And then we go on to the English attempts to quash the rebellion into Scotland, leading to repeated ambushes and defeats at the hands of the Scots. Then we cut back now, finally, to an hour and 8 minutes into the film, to Robert the Bruce Sr., corrupt, shifty, lord arguing with his son, Robert the Bruce Jr. So my question to you ladies is, what did you think of the Bruces in this movie?
The Bruce, the senior, is unlikable throughout the whole movie. The Robert the Bruce, played by Angus McFadden, I believe his name is. I like the actor. I see him from time to time in things, but he's hot and cold. He's kind of generally unlikable, and he has a whole character arc that you have to like
He's
him
very
through.
like you find him very like cowardly almost, right? Like kind of like his father, and you're like, man, get a backbone, because you're kind of your dad's little bitch, and your dad's a bitch, and you're a bitch, and it's just a whole bunch of bitches hanging out, sitting there being less than desirable, honestly. Like, where's your ride or die? Where's your lane loyalty, dude? You're not just on Scotland's side, you're on William's side now, because you're like, these guys aren't going to do shit. We need to take matters into our own hands.
Well, can I drop a little bombshell in here for everybody? So the name of the movie is Braveheart, and it's a movie about William Wallace. Braveheart actually was a moniker that referred to Robert the Bruce.
When you told me
if
that,
I'm
I
not
was
mistaken,
like,
right?
why is this movie about William Wallace? I was like, this is so
right. I mean, not that like when I've been in Scotland, I've seen Robert the Bruce always like Braveheart, Robert the Bruce, Braveheart, Robert the Bruce, but just historically speaking, that was kind of the, like Richard the Lionhearted, like Braveheart was kind of like this little thing that was thrown to Robert the Bruce. And I mean, I don't know if that's true. You can always correct me, historian. You're the real one over there. So if you don't know anything about that, then I will delete that. But also, like, what I do know, I don't know a lot about Robert the Bruce, but what I do know is that wasn't as he was portrayed in the movie and the things that he will do in the movie. I think probably if you want to see a really good portrayal of Robert the Bruce, Outlaw King with Chris Pine, as we were talking about earlier, that's a much better and more historically accurate depiction of like what's going on then. Really good portrayal of like the portrayal, of the history that was going on at that time, and also probably maybe more accurately what Robert the Bruce was like versus how he is shown in Braveheart.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, I think so.
That was my knee-jerk reaction to it.
Okay, so Katie and Laurel, I can respond to both of you. Katie, you're not just thinking like an American, you're also thinking like a modern person, right?
Yep, that's fair. Checks out.
Okay, what I mean by that is the idea of the nation is relatively new in the last couple of 100 years, really. And if you went back in time, even if you went back in time to 1776, even, for example, you would find, or let alone 1276 or whatever, the average person wouldn't necessarily relate to someone who lived in what we now would think of as their country and see them as connected to them. You would be born in a medieval town or village or farm. You'd probably never travel more than 15 miles from the place of your birth. You would have a relationship with your landlord or liege lord. You'd have a relationship with their lord, potentially, but only through them. And you'd have a sense of connection to the monarch, the king, head of the state. But that doesn't mean you're going to have a relationship with the person who's the next town over or 20 towns over. If you think about like Scotland, for example, so the west coast of Scotland and the east coast are really quite distinct. We talked about the accents a little bit. I've been talking about how distinct they are. There's a really big mountain range in the middle of Scotland. In fact, getting from the east to the west of Scotland, getting from, say, where I'm from, the northeast to Glasgow, would be way easier to take a ship all the way around than it would be to go across land.
Is it like the Pass of Cattaraugus? It's like, and exactly, walking by, and you're like, "This is bullshit."
Yeah, just gotta go get the eagles to fly you, right?
So, obviously, the eagles are Scottish. Yeah.
So the very concept of nationhood would not have existed at this time, let alone discussions about freedom. It would have been meaningless because in the medieval period, everyone had a place in the world. And just as is natural for you, my dear American, friends, just as it makes complete sense for you to think, yes, personal liberty is a thing, yes, freedom is a thing. In the medieval period, it would have made as much sense for people to say, there's a place for me in this world, and it gives me some, but not very much freedom, and that's okay. In fact, that's not only okay, I'd fight to preserve that system. Everyone had a different relationship. So if someone condescends to you, for example, right, you don't like that. No one likes to be condescended to. But in the medieval period, the word to condescend was actually a really kind thing to do to someone, because it meant that someone of a higher status was coming down to your level. They were gracing you.
How the tides have turned.
That's a function of the Enlightenment, which comes in the 18th century, right, where everyone has access to knowledge now. And just because someone's born of a different status doesn't mean they have more moral or intellectual authority. So you're watching this movie thinking, yes, all the stuff about freedom, it resonates with us. It would have made no sense to practically anyone who's actually being depicted.
What are
here.
you guys talking about? And be like, what?
You mean the freedom of our Lord, like to control the lands?
What is this? What is this freedom that you speak of?
Yeah, because they have a totally
Interesting,
different
yeah.
social contract. So the word Lord, for example, is derived from protector of the bread. You know, the Lord is someone whose job is to protect the people who's on their lands, and he's one of the ways in which, and it is, I say he, it's mostly he's. One of the ways in which they do it is by having military service built into the social contract, so people come together, and that Lord is able to raise an army which will then protect the land, protect the supply of bread, protect the food supply. That's the social contract. And you don't want freedom in that. You want a strong Lord. So, yes, you're thinking like an American. So that's where the freedom thing comes from. But also the idea that you'd even relate to someone 30 miles down the road is a relatively modern invention. You'd have a much more sense of localism. So all of this talk in the movie about Scotland as an entity really resonates with us, but it wouldn't have resonated practically at all below the noble level, right? Because what has someone in the Northeast got in common with someone from Glasgow? Or someone from the Highlands? They don't even speak the same language. Literally don't speak the same
Which is
language.
pretty crazy.
It makes a huge, huge difference. The islands are very, very different. Now, Scotland does exist as a state, but the idea of the nation, especially the ethnic nation, is really, really new. So when you're watching a movie like this, and the more your modern heart beats faster, know that the faster your heart beats, the less likely it is to be reflecting a modern attitude. Because the things we take to be, I'm using this language very carefully for UK, self-evident truths were not in earlier time periods. You might feel kinship to your ancestors, but your ancestors almost certainly wouldn't feel kinship with you. And that's just the way history is. It's a strange land.
And that's
the rules are
awesome point, though. Like, take that filter and apply it to everything throughout history. And I'm like, wow, that's crazy. That changes a lot.
It does. And that's the best part, right? And that's a really jarring lesson for people to learn. You know,
Good.
like, hang on a second.
It's good for you.
Yeah, like I live in England, I feel kinship with other English people, for example, or, you know, and I feel that with people in the past. Like, they wouldn't feel that for you, my friend, unfortunately. So, Laurel, you were talking about Robert the Bruce and him being depicted as weak. What he's certainly depicted as being a turncoat. He's constantly changing sides. And that did happen, not just with Robert the Bruce, but many Scottish nobles. So you'll find over the extended period of time, Scottish nobles switched sides all the time because they were following self-interest, not the national interest, because there was no such thing. Just like I explained to Katie there was no concept of nationalism. In fact, Scottish nobles would have had way more in common with English nobles than they would have the common people of the country in which they were. And it didn't necessarily matter who your king was, so long as the person who was king was just and they were giving you or protecting the land and the resources
Providing for you.
You already have. Yeah, so long as they're protecting the triangle of which you're very near the top, that was often enough for many. And that's what makes William Wallace, the real William Wallace, such a really interesting character, because he was a minor noble and he did genuinely draw quite a lot of broad support.
That's like, when you said that like blew my mind. I was like, how the fuck did William even convince anybody to follow him then? Like, when you said that, I was like, that's even more unbelievable.
Why? Because the system around him was really unjust. And because the English were misruling Scotland.
This is the point where we get to talk about a couple of my favorite, one of my favorite characters in this movie. She's a minor character, but she just brings a whole lot. You know what I mean? It's a minor character, brings a lot to the table. And that is Princess Isabella's lady in waiting. I just love her. So Isabella's French, her lady in waiting is also French, and the two ladies are walking. they're walking behind Edward II and like his buddies, and she's just kind of doing that, like, you gotta like follow
His
the people around,
entourage.
his entourage, right? But she says like, hey, your husband is making plans to send troops up to Scotland to like do something about this William Wallace. And Isabella's like, what? I didn't know this. How do you know this? Her lady in waiting's like, I slept with somebody on the war council, so so I'm in the know. So she's kind of like gets her like these behind the scenes details of like what's going on and keeping her abreast of the situation. But then she has this moment where she tells the princess, like, this William Wallace, though, meow, girl, let me tell you all about him. She tells the princess that he is fighting for his love who's been murdered, that they tempted him out with her death, and then they went to his brother's and father's graves and went to like desecrate the graves and like set a trap for him at his love's grave, and this whole thing, right? Like, it's very romantic. And the princess is literally, you see her go like that. She kind of swoons and she sits back, and they're like, oh, that's love, no, is what she says. And she says, love, I wouldn't know. Right. So the princess is saying like, oh, I'm in this marriage where
Nor
I'm
would
not
any other
loved.
royal, because I don't
Yeah.
think anyone in any royal family has ever married for love. But if you want to be special,
Yeah. Now, yeah. So it kind of sets up this moment of like, oh, like this William Wallace, he's not just some guy starting trouble in the north. He's got dimension. He's got this love and romantic, and this is so cute kind of thing. So how interesting. But yeah, so we have like this little moment of romance where this romantic story gets told to the princess. And then we're moving on to like a really big moment in the movie. Because again, like as the lady in waiting mentioned, they're going to be sending the Northern Army to meet with Wallace and do something about it. They're sending a whole lot of men up there.
Can I get you to put a pin in that for just a second?
Sure.
Interject and let you know that the princess in that scene would have been 2 years old at the time. And not
That's what I meant to say. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So just putting out there. But Edward the First's wife, Margaret, did go on campaigns with him to Scotland. I don't think she was particularly interested in the Scottish cause, but they've kind of fused those two characters together. So Edward II's wife, the princess, does not at any point sleep with William Wallace at all. Wasn't even in the same country as him. Anyway, sorry, historian nitpick aside.
No. Thank you for mentioning it. That was actually supposed to be one of the first things I said, and I got really excited about that lady in waiting. I have that as number 5 on my envelope. Isabel's only 2. Yeah, so this whole love story that happens between her and Wallace is a moot point, but adds a little sexy interest into the whole thing. But yeah, thank you. They're sending this army north, and now we're at this build-up for a big moment in the movie. Darren, do you want to discuss that, like what's happening before Stirling?
Okay, so in real life, Andrew Maury and William Wallace are now coming together. Right, so the two halves of the Scottish Rebellion are coming together. And Andrew Maury is the mastermind of what would eventually become the Battle of Stirling Bridge. So one of the things that this movie does is kind of give William Wallace credit for inventing really long spears, which he did not invent. They were actually a mainstay of the Scottish Army. And they were, how do you pronounce this? Skiltrons, I think they're called, which is like tight, square-shaped formations of men, really powerful defensive formations. They would later be used to great effect offensively by Robert the Bruce many years later. In this battle, really, really important. So, no, William Wallace does not invent the idea of long spears. They've been around as long as sticks have. These long sticks. So, don't be fooled by that. Wonderful scene, and it introduces my favourite character in the whole movie, the obligatory crazy Irishman who always appears in every movie about Scottish people. We've always got a crazy Irish bestie.
Stephen! Yes.
I've come to the right place then. Absolutely insane. Saves William Wallace from an assassination attempt. Some turncoats I absolutely adore. Stephen.
Yes. Yeah. Same. I like that when he's met and he's like, yep, I'm coming over to help you out, William Wallace and crew. And I am the most wanted man on my island. And then Hamish is like, your island? You mean Ireland? And he's like, yeah, it's mine. And he's frequently looking up at the sky and going, all right, Father, I'll ask him, or all right, Father, this, or whatever. And he's talking to the sky. Yeah, but I love him. I think he's great.
Yeah, me too. Okay, so what else is happening in real life? So Andrew Morey and William Wallace are coming together, and Andrew Morey is the architect of this battle, one of the most important victories in this time period and all the wars of Scottish independence, because Stirling was one of the key locations within Scotland right into the 18th century, right up to the last Jacobite rebellion. Controlling Stirling was always key. It's the gateway to the Highlands. If you control Stirling, you control the way in and out of the Highlands. Essentially, a very powerful, well-defended castle. And this is the battle that shows Morey's military brilliance, although in this movie it's really just William Wallace. But they do change it quite a bit because there's, having seen a little bit of the video you guys recorded, I think, Katie, you picked up on this, there's a certain missing architectural feature from the landscape in the Battle of Stirling Bridge here.
Yeah, there's no fucking bridge.
There's no fucking bridge, quite right. Why was the bridge important?
I mean, it only decided the whole landscape around them to even let them win in the first place. But why have it in there? It's just a minute detail.
Do you know why the bridge was such an important thing to the actual battle?
All I know is something about bottlenecking.
Essentially. So they let the English forces cross the bridge, and then the vanguard would get on the other side, and then they attacked the vanguard in really close formations with spears, right? The English had their back to the river, and the bridge itself was so narrow you could only just about get two riders riding next to each other across at a time. So you have a stream of riders going across. So the Scots attack the vanguard, and they're unable to form, and they just get slaughtered. So we don't know the Scottish losses there, but probably not very great, but the English losses were really massive. Then, of course, they try to get back on the bridge. People are coming over the bridge. Then the bridge collapses. And then seeing this, the English army sort of breaks up and flees, and then they get pursued. And that's how Stirling was captured. So that's the real history of it. But this is also the battle where Andrew Morey dies. And it's probably the reason no one, not just you two, but no one, including anyone in Scotland, knows who the heck he is. There's not a single monument to Andrew Morey in all of Scotland.
Wow.
He's an absolutely obscure figure because at this point, he just disappears from the story. And had he survived, I think it would have been really different. So there's letters that were issued by Wallace and Morey, quote unquote, after the battle, because essentially they were starting to take kind of control of the country. They were trying to open the country back up to trade with Europe, for example. So they're sending out letters to European capitals, essentially saying Scotland's back open for business, signed William Wallace and Andrew Morey. And it could, and that lasts for a few more months. So it could be that Morey died in the battle itself, or he sustained injuries in the battle that resulted in him dying a few months later. But either way, he leaves the story, functionally the mythology of this period now, because no one really writes any stories or poems about him. He doesn't last any further past this, so there's not as many stories to tell about him. And he's become one of the great obscure heroes of Scottish history.
That's the sound of me sticking my broadsword into the ground so I can do this mid-roll. Welcome to episode 100. Look at us, we're hitting milestones. And the biggest thanks goes to you for being here. Now, whether it is your first episode in the Smoke Circle or whether this is your 100th, our success, and I guess ultimately the amount of episodes that we do, depends on you. So to help us hit 100 more episodes and at least that many more new listeners, please make sure that you're following and subscribing to the show so you never miss an episode. But also subscribing and rating and reviewing shows the almighty algorithm that High Tales of History is loved by fun and beautiful history lovers that have good taste, like yourself. If you want to keep up with us in between episodes, you can find us on various social media platforms such as Instagram at High Tales of History or on TikTok at High Tales of History Pod. I also mentioned at the top of the show we have a Patreon. We call it the Best Buds Club. And over there we have the Braveheart movie reaction from Katie and I, as well as some other historical movie nights in which I'm watching Gladiator and Outlaw King. We also have mini half-baked episodes, in case you just want more episodes that no one else has heard before, because it's all exclusive to you as a best bud. That's patreon.com/High Tales of History. All of our social media and our Patreon are directly linked into our show notes below. All right, so we left things off in the middle of the Battle of Stirling Bridge, so I'm going to try to pull this sword back out of the dirt so we can move on. All right, this might take a while, so let's just puff pass it. On to part 2.
So when we're looking at the Battle of Stirling then in Braveheart, what's happening in the movie then that's that different?
So the Scottish army, there's a few nobles there, and their armies start fleeing from them. Wallace sort of shows up and kind of takes control of the army. That's kind of all nonsense, basically. The nobles make some half-hearted "stop men, don't flee," some half-hearted effort. And then we get the most rousing speech in movie history, I think. One that would have made absolutely no sense whatsoever to anyone who's actually on that battlefield, but resonates with the liberty-loving hearts of my dear American compatriots here.
And he delivers this in the iconic blue face paint, half the face painted blue with like a little bit up the other side. Now, since you are from the northeast of Scotland, that's more of like, one, we're out of time with that one. And that's another one of those things where I like the tartans and kilts. It's been unpinned from another place in history and then stuck on this one moment in this movie so we can kind of put together the coolest looking Scottish man here on the battlefield. Where does the blue paint come from if it doesn't come from this time period?
So that's from the Picts. So that's about 700 years too late, probably. So the Picts were the indigenous people of what we now call Scotland, who were encountered by the Romans, and they called them the Picti, or the Picts for painted people, because they probably painted their faces. Probably, maybe just for fun, but probably before battle would be my suspicion. So that's where the Picts come from. No, there's no evidence that Scottish or any other people on the British Isles painted their face before battle at this time, but it does look cool as heck. But yeah, this is where we're getting the greatest hits of pre-modern Scottish culture all jammed together. You've got the Picts or Pictish makeup from like 400 AD, 300 AD, actually before that, actually. It's about 1,000 years too late. And then kilts from like the 15th, 16th, 17th century kind of brought backwards, and then,
voila,
fashion sense jammed in there with all the matted hair and so on and so forth. So yeah, really iconic look, but definitely not historically accurate. But what was wonderful and probably not accurate either was my favourite line in the film. If the real William Wallace was here, he'd consume them with fireballs from his eyes and bolts of lightning from his arse.
So did he have this larger than life reputation that preceded him amongst the people during that time?
We have no idea. The medieval period is like really unknowable in some really fundamental ways. Mm-hmm. Like there's not that many sources, and what survives is really, really fragmentary. Like we don't really know exactly when he was born, right? We don't really know. You go a few hundred years in the future, we don't really know when Shakespeare was born, sometime between April 19th or April 23rd, which means he either was born on his death day or he wasn't, which feels like a big thing, right? And a lot of the people from this period, we don't know who their parents were. We don't know if it was someone's first wife or second wife, was the mother of person X. We know that this person existed because they had a mother, but we don't know anything about her. Like the record is super duper fragmentary, and people were not recording an awful lot about each other's personalities. So there's no, as far as I'm aware, I don't think we have any excellent documents produced by Wallace. I think we've got this. No, he had a little coat of arms, which is a bow and arrow on a shield. I don't think we have any surviving documents that kind of he wrote or produced. And what people say about him later on, or even during his own lifetime, he was definitely charismatic, but was he charismatic in a good way or because he was a right bastard? We don't really know. And that's a really intriguing thing. Just remember, history is fundamentally unknowable, right? I always tell my students, it's like being led blindfolded into a car park, or in your language, a parking lot, and you have the blindfold removed, and someone points to an empty parking bay and says, "Tell me about the car that used to be there." Right? And like in some cases, there'll be like flecks of paint, the hint of exhaust fumes in the air. You might be really lucky and there's CCTV in that parking lot, and you can go and review it. And maybe they weren't driving fast enough that it's not a blur. Maybe it's color footage. Maybe you can even see who's inside the car. You might even get a hint of the relationship between the people in the car, or you might have none of that. And the further back in time you go, the harder it is, the lower resolution the past becomes. Never forget, the past is unknowable, which is what makes it so blinking exciting to study.
Yeah, that's a really great analogy. It's really great.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And as Wallace says at the end of his little speech, Alba gu Braith, Scotland forever, or Scotland until judgment, which is the literal translation. So, Katie, that's the little bit of Gaelic in this movie for you. I just wanted to make sure that someone threw it out there in the film.
Somebody had to have some in there.
Absolutely, absolutely.
If we're cherry picking from Scottish history, that had to be in there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the Scottish rugby team have that logo printed on the cuffs of their new uniforms from the most recent
nice.
season.
That's cool.
So. Did you guys enjoy this battle sequence? Because I absolutely loved it. And I thought the stunt people were the MVPs, especially the horse stunt people. And I was thinking about Katie as I was watching it, with horses flying and people somersaulting off them. What did you guys think of the battle?
It's no Helm's Deep, but it's a good one.
That's a very high standard to beat.
Yeah, man, that's like the pinnacle, I feel like, right there. Not that the fields of Pelennor are bad, because, I mean, we're comparing, like, the greatest to the greatest right now, but Helm's Deep, oh. Anyway, yeah, Stirling Bridge. Minus the bridge.
Minus the bridge.
And
also Stephen, like, the Lord thinks he can get me out of this one, but he's pretty sure you're fucked.
His like wild laugh.
Most unhinged laugh in all of Hollywood.
Actually, this is the moment right before the battle starts. Thank God that they brought forward those tartans, because then we get that really great moment that Katie was completely shocked about, where they stand up and one guy goes, and he lifts up the front of his kilts. And
look at how much this movie would have missed out on if it went with historical accuracy every time. There would be no cock and balls on the screen, which, in my opinion,
buckling their breeches.
It would take so long, though. Like, think about it.
Exactly. It would be, arrows would be flying, though.
Already. It would have taken too long. And you know what? I think that there's something in the spirit of Scotland in that scene that you would miss out on by getting rid of the kilt, so the kilt stays.
Mm-hmm. Katie loved that she was seeing an unedited version of Braveheart for the first time since seeing it on TV. She's like, that guy's dick's out. And then she's like, oh my God, their asses are out. You know, the bagpipes are playing, they're yelling, they're like mooning the English, they're slapping their butts, they're pulling up their kilts in the front. And there's something that's just, as it comes out of that roar, that, as Katie says, there's something in the Scottish spirit there. And I think it's really trying to like speak to like the heart of the people. Like, oh, don't you want to just be on their side? You know what? They're the underdogs. Also, they're pretty funny. They're pretty funny. They'll just flash and moon and whatever. They don't give a shit.
We're very weird what's under our kilts. Like, if you're wearing a kilt, there's no ambiguity there. Like, you're aware that you're underwearless. Let me put it that way. Like, the elements are a constant reminder to you of what's happening down there, right? So there's definitely something of the Scottish spirit, and like, believe me, the more people drink, the less inhibited they become. Yeah. Again, so there's a warning for my next wedding. Like, you are forewarned. This is your, like, bear that in mind. Subject on something else.
Sure.
Actually, before I do, Kate, I want to know about your feelings. The first time you saw the unedited version of this, was it delight, shock, anger?
I'm going to play it here for anyone who wants to watch it. But then, yes, Kate, let's hear your reaction now.
He just got his dick out. Kilts up. Oh, everybody's kilts up. I don't remember this in the movie at all. Depending on what you saw it on, that always gets censored if it's on TV. Obviously. They had their bullocks out. That's amazing. Moose. And there go the arrows, shields.
Oh God.
Quick shields. Shields,
Like
boys.
faster, please.
Boys, shields, thank you.
Oh,
Goodness
God.
gracious.
To be fair, they were looking into the sun.
That's true.
I'm gonna give them a bit of leeway here. Like audibly snorted so hard.
His laugh is the best.
The instant, yeah, exactly. As soon as they
out.
How did I miss this version? This is incredible.
Because they'll never show it on TV. Oh no, arrows again. Boys, cheeks in, shields up. Cheeks in, shields up.
I mean, I just remember it was the funniest thing I'd see. I think I just threw back my head and was like dying laughing because it was that funny. I mean, who doesn't love some good old elementary school humor?
I'm glad you got so much from that scene, Katie. Let me tell you, back home, everyone loved that.
Mm-hmm.
Historical
sure.
to be damned. We loved it. It was absolutely fabulous. Do you know what else I loved watching this? Did anyone get this? The English lord in charge of this army had very strong Sheriff of Nottingham / Rottingham vibes.
Yes.
Or Robin Hood Men in Tights.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
very much
this
so.
was in fashion if that was the type of English noble villain from the time.
Yeah, real dark goatee and mustache. And I was like, yes, he definitely has that.
Absolutely necessary.
Yep.
Yep. And again, small thing. Scots aren't wearing any armour. They've got some extra leather cladding that looks more from the Viking era, frankly. No chainmail for them or anything like that. But the infantry charge was suitably horrifying. And then there's a He-Man howl with a sword swung in the air by Wallace at the end of the battle. He might as well have shouted, "I have the power." Katie, do you remember He-Man? Are you old enough for that?
Oh yeah, we have an episode on He-Man that I did actually.
Have I not seen? I've not seen or heard.
Very early days. I'll put it in the show notes. So if anyone's interested, He-Man, Masters of the Universe. I have a note. William Wallace did 2 sword sticks in the ground after the Stirling Bridge battle. Well, Bridgeless Stirling Bridge. Yeah, I was like 2 times they stuck it in there. I was like, oh, Katie's gonna hate this, but in
one of them it like waves wildly because I remember you were like, and look, it's just waving. I was like, yeah, you mean bending in the wind because that's a good thing to do with your weapon.
Well, one thing that the absence of the bridge does to Britain, I guess one thing that brings to the fore in terms of history is that the Scots were always outmatched numerically by the English in these wars. Mm-hmm. So by the time you get to the final battle, which is Bannockburn in 1314, which is only shown briefly at the very end of this film, that's where Robert the Bruce leads the charge, England had dispatched its largest ever army to Scotland by that point. And in the it was at least 1.5 to 3 times larger than the Scottish army. So and when you numbers like that, the smaller army loses unless you've got some significant tactical advantage. Whereas in this, it's just like a lot of fighty, shouty bombs in the air. Then we go into the post-battle sequence where we see Sir William Wallace being knighted, honours given to Hamish, this movie's Chewie.
Oh, he is.
He is this movie's Chewie, for sure. William Wallace was knighted and he was appointed Guardian of Scotland, a position he held for a relatively short period of time. Some of the Balliols are present in this scene. So you'll remember from my little history lesson at the start, the Balliols were the family that the exiled king belonged to, because at this time, Andrew Murray and William Wallace were basically fighting in the name of John Balliol, but mostly independent of him, in fact, entirely independent of him. He didn't really have anything to do about this. And then we get reintroduced to Robert the Bruce, whose name we heard at the Battle of Stirling, before the Battle of Stirling Bridge, that he was refusing to take the field. And he's essentially depicts himself as an admirer of Wallace. He fights for freedom and all that good stuff. And then we get the attack on York with more homophobia. I think the person in charge of York talks about my sodomite cousin, quote unquote, referring to Edward II. So very 90s casual homophobia dropped in there.
Yeah. That's right.
Get more evidence of how brutal medieval warfare could be. Burning oil poured all over those attacking York. Very ouch.
Mm-hmm.
And then back to Edward II. The sexuality of Edward II in reality isn't known. We know he was married. We know his wife hated him. We know he had a son, and we know his wife essentially put his son on the throne by having Edward II killed. So not the most effective leader or person in the world. But here he's depicted in a really interesting and maybe problematic way. But Edward I is monstrous and ruthless and the villain I just love to hate the most. Especially in this scene, because he takes Edward II's lover and hurls him out of a window.
Just throws him right out there. And then Edward, in his shock and anger and sadness, pulls dagger on old daddy and goes to try and kill him himself. But Edward I easily just gets him to the ground just with a sweep with his hand. Yeah, and it's just like gets him down there. And that's not a family I'd want to like spend a holiday with. That's no thanks.
Feels awkward.
The quietest dinner ever.
Yeah.
It's just cutlery sounds.
Oh, and that would be just the worst too, as well, on top of the awkwardness, like audibly.
I mean,
Just
sexuality
weird.
was so much probably more fluid back then as well. People wouldn't have identified as gay or straight, regardless of what we would now project onto them.
Interesting, yeah.
Although it's not, the characters don't necessarily, well, I mean, they use the word sodomite, which is also a very nasty sort of way of describing someone's sexuality, but yeah, clearly has no interest in women in his life. In fact, just to rub salt into the wounds, this is where King Edward I declares that the mere sight of Edward II would encourage the Scots. So he decides to send the princess. And so starts the next part of my notes, which I call the Princess Diaries. Because this is the point where the movie pivots weirdly
and hard
into a love story again.
With a person, again, we know this specifically definitely did not happen, not in any sort of way, shape, or form, because again, Isabella wasn't even in the country and she was 2 years old. So like, this is like, we are making this happen.
Again, yeah, it's like, why even put it in there then?
I think, I think she's kind of Isabella in this is a fusion between Margaret, Edward I, and Isabel's characters in sort of real life. But I think it's also, one thing that works well is about the Scottish alliance with the French. So the Scottish were in alliance with France at this time, and France kept not really sending any help or money, which is what Scotland needed. But that was our FU alliance to the English. We call it the Auld Alliance. In fact, so even now, in fact, I'm sure in Paris there's a Scottish pub called the Auld Alliance. So, so that was really, really important. So maybe it's just a general anti-Englishness amongst most of the peoples in that part of the world, on the British Isles, in France, on the continent. They just weren't terribly popular at that time, I'm afraid to say. Great costume for the princess. William Wallace is visited by his ghost wife, who is thematically connected to Isabella, on her visit. They exchange views, and the princess's eyes are open, not least because Wallace is able to understand Latin when he's been insulted in front of himself by Isabella's advisor. I'm just a savage, he says. Again, tying this idea that Scottish people are savages. Actually, this is really interesting. Like, Katie, you said earlier, like, they not wearing kilts back then is disappointing. The podcast we need to do has to be about the Jacobites, because that's the one where all of the iconography, other than the face paint, that you really want, it's all in there. And the Highlanders, Scots Highlanders, were widely seen as savages, and basically they were compared to Native Americans. So if we had a Native American population in the British Isles, so to speak, then at the time that would have been Highlanders, not Scots, but Highlanders specifically. They were seen as beasts, as savages. They wore kilts, they played bagpipes, and they were really, really ferocious in battle. In fact, they won every single battle they fought, except for one, the last one. And boy, did they lose that one. That was a really catastrophic defeat.
Yeah.
So the Highlanders would frequently just scare the British, not the English, the British armies that were facing away, who were poorly trained, undisciplined, and they used to essentially just scream really loudly and freak them out and act crazy. And that's how they would chase them away. So if you are thinking, as I pop these historic myths, just remember there are versions of Scotland out there that do fit the stereotype, just not in this period of time. Yeah. So what do you guys think about the princess in the scene?
I think she does this great job of showing a inner strength that she has, and she's very intelligent and kind of commands the room in this, and that's nice. There's a moment where her eyes are open to like what sort of what like atrocities have been happening in Scotland, perpetrated by the English, and she seems surprised by this, like, what? This is what's happening. So it adds a little layer of sympathy in with this as well too. And he's telling her like, one day you're going to be a queen and you need to be able to see these things. And I feel like she has this moment of showing her strength and power, and there's like some vulnerability there of like between the two of them, and like if what's happening is it kind of wins her over a little bit. And it does, because then doesn't she go back to the king and she's like,
starts making demands and whatnot.
She's like, yeah, he says he'll be here if you're man enough to face him. And of course she does it in a way that's like, I'm just don't shoot the messenger. I'm just telling you this is what's happened.
And brings up the things in front of him too, like the bad things. And doesn't he tell her it's just that's what it takes to rule a country? Like a woman wouldn't be strong enough or understand or something like that. Mm-hmm. Doesn't that happen?
From Edward the First.
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that. He uses her as a ruse, really. He uses her to like kind of go and distract and talk and pretend that there's going to be some sort of negotiation or something that happens, right? When all the while Edward the First was secretly calling up reinforcements to send there and has already been sending them in process. So whatever came out of that meeting with her and William Wallace, the king already had other plans as to what he was going to be doing. So,
and her lady in waiting goes to deliver a secret message to Wallace from the princess, as their love slowly blossoms into apparently a tactical alliance. Okay, so next up we move to the Battle of Falkirk, which is probably one of the most devastating moments in Wallace's career. So we're near 1298, so the Battle of Stirling Bridge is 1297. Battle of Falkirk, and when William Wallace is knighted and becomes Guardian of Scotland, is 1298. This battle ultimately destroys Wallace's military credibility and his following. Right, so the movie feels like it takes place probably over like a 6-month period. Most of the major events in Wallace's life that are covered in this movie take place over about 3 years, and in reality, Wallace won't die until 1305. So there's like another 7 years of life after this defeat. In the movie, it's just kind of shown through a montage of him running through some hills, so you can see some nice shots of the Scottish Highlands. So the Battle of Falkirk, Robert the Bruce is still dithering, as he is wont to do. William Wallace calls him to action. Bruce is clearly inspired by him, and the Bruce is frustrated by his own followers who keep telling him not to go to war. This is where William Wallace tells him to unite the clans, which I'm not entirely sure what that means.
With like a handshake clasp thing, like
a predator.
Unite the clans, like predator.
Dylan,
and there it is. I'm just trying to, and it's kind of sustained and held, but unite the clans. I'm going to use it as my new handshake to people. Robert the Bruce Senior and Junior.
I don't know. He's getting more leprosy by the hour, I think. Claims that his actions are peering out through bandages, looks like the Mummy from like a 1940s production or something. It's fabulous. Claims that his actions are for Scotland. That only Robert the Bruce Jr. can be king, and he can only be king if he follows Edward I, because the Scots can never win, basically. And this is about the time where Robert the Bruce switched sides. He was following Edward I at this point. We don't know why. We do know that his alliance with Edward I was very, very shaky, and obviously not to last. We don't know if he was playing the long game. We don't know if Robert the Bruce Senior, who's clearly a very canny politician, a really clever diplomat, just didn't think the Scots could win and discouraged him from taking part in a war of rebellion when in fact he could have power if he followed Edward I instead. And then the battle starts, where we have more crazy Irishmen who charge at the Scots, slow down, and then shake their hands, which is a wonderful, very unlikely scenario. Not least because did they plan this in advance? Did everyone agree on it? I mean, it's just not the sort of, if you're an Irish conscript and you're told to fight, you fight. If you're a Scottish or English conscript for that matter, you pretty much fight in the direction you're told to fight. So a lovely moment, but not a very realistic one.
So he's just stuck the sword in the ground to say hello to all of his new Irish friends and everything. And they're like, hey, welcome to our crew. This is the cool kids side now. And welcome over here. Light the field on fire with an arrow. And now the flame.
Yeah, I forgot that happened.
Yeah, now the field's on fire. Shit's going on. And
fire makes it better.
Yeah. And here they go. They've got a wall of fire between them and the English. The English were already advancing. People are burning up in the fire. William Wallace signals to his nobles on the horses, "Hey, Mornay, Lachlan, hey, come on, boys, jump in this fight. Let's go." And they look at him, and they turn their horses and ride away. The bastards. Feel that rage, Katie. Feel that rage bubble up inside you.
There's a lot of word, but while we have an explicit rating, sometimes there's a time and a place for vulgarities.
This is a place, yeah. So there is the big betrayal of the Scottish nobles and William Wallace on the battle, like in the middle of the battle, is like, oh fuck. So what?
Yeah.
So Doc, tell us a little more, please, about what's happening there. Like was this something that actually happened in the battle? Like what's going on in all this?
But the betrayal of nobles almost never happened in the midst of battle, because then they might get turned upon by the army that they were betraying, right? It's a dramatic effect. But what did happen was, yes, the rebellion of the Scottish nobility basically stopped before it started. There was no in the battle betrayal or anything like that. If anything, this was really just a case of bad tactics by Wallace, because the English absolutely decimate the Scots with their longbowmen. We have evidence. We found bodies, not me personally or anyone here, of English.
Dug them up myself.
Exactly right. But you often find they've got one overdeveloped shoulder, like the bone is physically thicker. So they probably kind of looked a lot lopsided. If you were to go back to say 1298 and go to an average English village, you might find that the men, especially by early middle age, would be really well developed on one side compared to their other side. Not overdeveloped for the reason you're thinking. But sorry, I messed up. Although the delay in the amount of time that it took you to get that does speak quite highly of who you are as people. So
I was like, I'm going to take the high road here, and I was like, no, I can't. The weed says no.
You're already high. And meanwhile, the archery nerd over here is like, yes, this is the time where we talk about the archers. It's very exciting. It's the only English thing I think I've really been into is the archers.
Yeah, well, Stirling Bridge, the longbowmen were out of range of the Scottish forces, so they couldn't really come to bear. Much later on, the Battle of Bannockburn, the Scottish knights disperse the longbowmen, which takes them out of contention, and then it just comes down to a slugfest.
Yeah.
Most of these battles would have almost certainly been very significantly in favour of the English because of how many infantrymen that they brought to bear. By 1314, we're still quite early on here. We're 1297, 1298. By 1314, it's not until that late that you get the largest English army invading Scotland up to that point. Tens of thousands of infantrymen, maybe up to 25,000, 16,000, 7,000. There's a lot of different estimates. Medieval people weren't very good at keeping count, and they did love to exaggerate. So all that's a little bit.
This is why school is important.
I think there's 100 here,
so that we can count properly.
Well, you'll find that medieval scholars describing battles of 200,000 people when there was probably 800. But on the
Yeah.
field at that moment, it probably felt like all of the warriors in the world were out to face you. It's probably really looking at 800 people with swords or axes or any weapon designed to cleave you apart. It's probably quite scary. And when there's several hundred of them, you know, we might not consider that a big battle, but if you're on the ground, it probably felt like the whole world was a way to rain down on you. So yeah, medieval numbers, definitely not to be trusted. The longbowmen in this movie and in reality decimate the Scots. Was there a betrayal? No, the Scottish nobility had already decided to side with Edward I. And this is the scene when I was growing up that always will stay with me. Because again, I was maybe like 13, maybe 14 years old or something like that when we watched it. In my best friend's house, his parents had their friends there, and people were literally on their feet pointing. You know, when people are like truly furious, like truly angry. That was what it was like. And it wasn't necessarily the betrayal of the Scottish nobles, but that had them on their feet angry. But it was the reveal at the end that it's Robert the Bruce who's charged at William Wallace. And I cannot describe to you the disappointment and fury of some of the people who I watched that movie with at that sort of revelation. And of course, Robert the Bruce did turn coat at different points. Always remember medieval history, even when it's put through a patriotic lens like this, is much more like Game of Thrones than it is anything else. Scottish, nobles are the same as nobles all over Western Europe. Very selfish in a lot of ways, concerned with their own power, and sometimes it doesn't really matter which king you serve. You're going to serve a king anyway, so the one who gives you the best terms or the best offer.
Right.
Whoever's
that's
winning.
Often the way it is. Yeah, and by this point, there wasn't necessarily any clear indication that Scotland would win, but also Scotland isn't fighting. Different nobles and groups are in rebellion, but there's no sort of unified force. So Robert the Bruce and Andrew de Moray, who obviously was dead by this point, he died because of his injuries at Stirling Bridge, they were supporters of John Balliol, at least nominally. So they fought in the name of King John, the exiled king, the weak one who was taken out before the story started. So there's also an element of, would the Bruces have fought with someone like Wallace when it would be to put their adversary back on the throne, and in essence eliminating themselves from contention for the Scottish throne. And of course, William Wallace was a minor noble, and very few nobles actually wanted to follow him because he wasn't noble enough, he wasn't rich enough, or didn't have enough acclaim. They certainly didn't owe him fealty, so why would they follow him? You know, the bonds of like nationality and pride in the country one belongs to that we take as self-evident truths certainly weren't at that time. What did you guys think of Robert the Bruce's betrayal?
Gasp, shock, horror. We were all William Wallace and his look of betrayal of like, oh no. Because the whole time he's been on the field next to Edward I, but he's had his helmet on. He's had his armor on over his face. So you've never seen his face until William Wallace chases this mysterious knight down, and then it's revealed. It's Robert the Bruce, and he's so shocked and he's so hurt. He's feeling a lot of feelings. When I first saw this movie, not understanding the actual history, I was like, oh gosh, this is gutting. This is a terrible thing. I like this. This is one of the people that he respects. He's told throughout the movie, I respect you. The people will follow you if you lead them. And, and it's him. Oh no. And now knowing the real history, I feel that also that anger and indignation of like, oh man, they've really made a creative choice here by making that happen.
Not one that was received well, it sounds like.
Yeah.
But also William Wallace and Robert the Bruce probably never met.
Mm-hmm.
Oh. Well, this movie's just full of bullshit, isn't it?
Yeah.
It works story-wise.
Sure.
And it does deal with the fact that, essentially one of Scotland's great national heroes for a time fought with King Edward. I mean, so did most of the nobles at the time, but, there's that in its favour, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess so. I'm not going to lie. This has been a disappointing journey into Braveheart. I really went in liking this movie, and I was like, damn. No kilts. No kilts. Paint? Absolutely not. That's bullshit, too.
Robert the Bruce's betrayal, really big moment for Scottish people watching that movie, especially in the mid-90s when it comes out, because this is when we're marching towards our first parliament in several hundred years and reopening that. That was a huge deal in Scotland, still is. In fact, Scotland has so much political power at the moment as a direct consequence of the fact that we campaigned for that parliament. So this movie sort of comes out in a build-up to a really interesting time for the people of Scotland. And poor Robert the Bruce here is depicted as really quite weak and ineffectual rather than a ruthless noble and simply a coward. After the battle, in the aftermath, he surveys the battlefield and shows his remorse and realises his remorse as he sees his fellow Scots torn asunder. And that leads us to the next scene with Robert the Bruce Juniors and Senior now looking worse by the second, where we get this clash of ideologies between the pair, where Robert Bruce tells his dad he fights for something I've never had and I took it from him and it's tearing me apart.
It's tearing me apart.
It's tearing. It makes one think of Tommy Wiseau in the room.
Lisa, you're tearing me apart. That's how I felt when I was. Yep.
I really hope there's a group of people who watch this movie now, and when that line comes on, they, in his accent, shout that at the screen. That would make me very happy. Again, lots more talk about freedom. Really interestingly, the men in this movie, I write in my notes, talk about freedom the way that James Dean used to talk about love. It's, this kind of a romance between the concept of freedom and all the men in this movie. Not really the women, I know.
Yep. Freedom for all of us, right? Pats her on the shoulder.
Yeah, pretty much.
It's like that scene in Mulan when he said something about, what about you, Ping? And she's like, what about a girl who's got a brain and always speaks her mind? And like, nah. I was like, brutal.
I should have saved that for the very last scene, right, where he redeems himself. Although he's redeeming himself here because we're seeing that Robert the Bruce is subject to forces much larger to himself, and we don't know why he turncoated at one point. And it could be as simple as noble politics. It could be pragmatic issues. Did he ever think Scotland could win, or that the rebels, I should say, of Scotland could win against such a massive and powerful nation as England when it was unleashing the majority of its fury upon that small country? Maybe. We just don't know. But we get to see Wallace carry out a series of revenge killings against the nobles, which is as satisfying as it is nonsensical. So do you guys know what happens at this point in Wallace's career in life?
Not a clue.
No.
Okay, so he's knighted in 1298 as the Guardian of Scotland, and he's knighted in John Balliol's name, right? The Battle of Falkirk happens, and that's a disastrous defeat for him, and it ruins his reputation as a military commander. So Falkirk is the last major battle Wallace fights in, and if you watch the movie, you'd think maybe it's only a few months before he gets executed, but it's absolutely not. It's closer to about 7 or 8 years.
Oh,
it's
wow.
13. Yeah, so the Battle of Falkirk is 1298, and he's not captured until 1305. So there's a long time lag in which Wallace doesn't do an awful lot. In 1299, he's sent to Europe to drum up support for the Scottish cause. By this point, France has signed a peace treaty with England, which allows England to bring the majority of its military force to bear on Scotland without worrying about giving up its ambitions elsewhere. So France and Scotland are nominally in an alliance, but that alliance doesn't really mean very much, especially because France keeps creating unilateral peace treaties with England. So once you get to 1299, Wallace is kind of out of the picture. What ends up happening is kind of a diplomatic effort instead. And Edward I is actually ordered by the Pope to stop violence against Scotland in this time. That's 1299. In the year 1300, he does what Edward I loved to do most, and that was re-invade Scotland again. 1301, he re-invades Scotland again. Yeah, and then in 1301 is when you get the actual real defection of Bruce to the English side. So it's not until 1301 that Bruce defects to the English side. And before that, he was appointed the Guardian of Scotland. Robert the Bruce was appointed Guardian of Scotland with a guy called John Comyn. Okay, so here's where things get complex. You ready?
All right.
Robert the Bruce's betrayal was brought forward in the movie by several years to 1298 to the Battle of Falkirk. In 1300, he's appointed joint guardian of Scotland with John Comyn, so he succeeds William Wallace. But Robert the Bruce and John Comyn utterly despise one another. They cannot stand one another.
Great.
In fact, if you ever heard the story about Robert the Bruce killing someone in a church and then being excommunicated for it, that was John Comyn. And the reason is several years later, after Robert the Bruce was nominally serving Edward I, he was planning to relaunch the rebellion. He went to John Comyn, told him this, and John Comyn betrayed him and the Scots to Edward I. So the betrayal of Robert the Bruce is brought forward by several years. He becomes guardian of Scotland. Probably his resentment of John Comyn was a factor in his going to Edward I. The two of them hated each other that much. And if you hate someone so much you're going to stab them to death in a church, you're in real trouble. So all of that drama you see in that one scene, it's not a personal portrayal of Wallace, who, by the time Robert the Bruce turns coat, is out of the picture, basically. He's not really an important figure anymore. Robert the Bruce is instead playing a game of noble chess with this guy, John Comyn. So that's what's happening in Wallace's life at this time. There's no revenge killings against the nobles. He doesn't really succeed in gathering up a significant force again, or any major battles or anything like that. He continues to agitate and continue to be a focal point for resistance, but ultimately he's betrayed in a place called Roylobston. And it's Scottish retainers. It's one of the nobles loyal to Edward I. It's his forces who capture William Wallace. Has nothing whatsoever to do with Robert the Bruce, and that's how he's taken into custody. So I'm getting ahead just a little bit than where we are in the film, but hopefully that context will maybe give you a little bit better understanding as we sort of work through it. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, ladies.
No, that was perfect. Thank you for studying that up, because
it's surprising to me that they even bothered grabbing Wallace at that point. Like, if he was, like, obviously they feared him if they still bothered to kill the guy, and then, like, very dramatically, I might add, like.
Mm-hmm. Well, the nature of the killing, the execution is telling, because he was executed as a traitor.
Yeah.
In other words, he betrayed his king, Edward I, which is an expression of, I'm your king. You can only be a traitor if you're betraying someone who you have to serve, right?
Oh,
yeah.
Gross.
The nature of that killing essentially implied, I'm Edward I, I'm the boss, and you will be fealty. It doesn't matter if you've personally sworn me fealty. You're in Scotland, Scotland's mine. And although William Wallace is no longer a major military commander, he's still active in the rebellion and still a significant focal point. And at the end of the day, every day he lives and isn't captured is a demonstration of the limits of England's power in Scotland. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So even if someone's not necessarily a direct threat, you think like, okay, so this isn't a comparison I thought I'd make, but take Osama bin Laden. Right. By the time he's killed, he's not organizing. It's not like there's not a 9/11 every 3 weeks or anything like this, right? But the killing of him was highly, highly symbolic.
Very
symbolic. Excuse me, highly symbolic, and was a great. It meant a lot to many Americans. It meant a lot to many people here. It meant a lot to many people who felt personally attacked or aggrieved or affected by the war on terror or the 9/11 terror attacks and so on and so forth. So why bother? It's a bit like that.
Mm-hmm.
Again, these aren't necessarily themes that are explored in depth in this movie, but every group in history practically always sees themselves as the good guys, right?
Yeah.
So Edward I thought what he was doing was great. Then, of course, so jumping back into filmland, we're getting the assassination of the nobles, and my favorite assassination certainly is the most impractical assassination I've ever seen on film, where Wallace rides a horse into a man's bedroom.
Meanwhile, I'm like, how to get the horse up the stairs? Horses hate stairs.
I mean, medieval stairs especially, they're not big. And they are narrow,
No.
they are steep, and they usually twist. Like,
Yeah.
I don't think a horse could physically be put up those stairs. The amount of effort that must have gone into getting that horse upstairs before then launching the horse
out the window.
Horse and
Well, actually, you know what? That's accurate. Horses cannot go downstairs. Did you know that?
They also shouldn't go through plate glass, but according to that movie, that's perfect. I mean, how big must the window have been in that bedroom?
And it was an open window, wasn't it? Like there was no obstruction. They just jumped out a hole out this. It was so weird.
That bedroom must have been 2/3 whole. Like,
right?
Imagine how cold it must have been to sleep in that room. If you can get a horse and a man easily, that's the thing, right?
They ride out, just ride out.
Yeah.
He doesn't duck.
The horse jumps, like it needs clearance, like above his head. Like this must have been about 12 foot tall. This window, but with no glass.
No glass. No.
It's just a giant hole in the side of the wall.
Mm-hmm. Maybe for movie purposes, they had a big old door that was on the inside that they could slide shut. But I don't know if they had that kind of technology at this time.
Well, we had the technology, Katie, but we didn't have the will to have a sliding door over a gigantic hole. We just didn't build holes in our castles because then they're not. Really
it's certainly not that large near the top either, because all you're going to get is wind.
Yeah, let me tell you, like Scotland's a windy place. And like the wind, like it doesn't like sneak up on you. It like assaults you. Like it's like takes you by the throat, punches you in the gut, and then slaps you, and then afterwards spits on you and demands that you thank it. That's the wind.
So it's like walking around Chicago in the winter. That sounds awful.
Yeah. Either way, I'm dubious that the horse up the stairs, let alone the escape. Where they pushed me out of the movie just a bit, but they are very funny.
Yes.
They are very funny.
Yeah. Renee is killed, and then he does some more running through the Highlands. We got a great Highlands montage scene of like
there's a lot of like Lord
of
the Rings-esque running. Yeah, for
over
sure.
the tops of the mountains.
Well, most of the movie was shot in Ireland because Ireland gave them 10 takes. Yeah, when it needs to be Scotland, it's Scotland.
Okay. So, like, those shots are Scotland, you think, right?
Oh yeah, no.
Okay, I was gonna say that would be really sad.
When the setting needs to look like Scotland, it's Scotland.
Oh right. Okay,
and when it's not, it's a studio in Ireland. Or like
Isn't there something just fundamentally wrong with shooting a movie about Scottish independence in Ireland? Does nobody else feel a qualm with that? I feel that feels wrong somehow.
It was a different time, Katie. I mean, let me put it this way, right? Have you seen the most recent Indiana Jones movie?
The Crystal Skull one, or no? Is there another one after?
The Dial of Destiny is the last one.
Oh Jesus, no! There's another one.
Or The Flash. Well, both of those movies, the city of Glasgow in Scotland is New York or Gotham.
Oh.
So
Indeed.
We get our revenge. We don't always appear in our movies as ourselves, but like the trans-loving nation we are, we doff different attire as our need and mood dictates.
It's like when I wandered into that Scottish Independence Day parade in New York. I was like, what? Did I ever tell you that, Laurel? I ended up in the middle of the parade when we were
Ferris
in New York.
Bueller?
Yes. And I was like, I don't even know how the fuck I got here. I think they had somebody playing Mary Queen of Scots on a horse. I assume so.
Maybe it was Tartan Day.
So let me think of what time of the year. It was in the spring. So
that would have been Tartan Day.
What the hell is Tartan? I didn't even know that was a thing until right now.
Tartan Day is something we tricked Americans into celebrating. We're like,
it's to celebrate. No, it's to celebrate the Declaration of Arbroath. But Americans call it Tartan Day. That was what I read that at the Abbey. Hang on, I'm looking it up right now. April 5th, Tartan Day parade, and it's like
right when I was there, dude.
And it's in New York City. It's the Tartan Day parade in New York City on April 5th,
and I walked right through the middle of it.
If memory serves, it was like late 90s, like 1998 or something like that. The U.S. Senate passed Tartan Day, and yes, they did do it on the day of the Declaration of Arbroath, but it's not like an official. Like no one in Scotland celebrates that day. We were just like,
and no one does here either. But it's just like a fun thing.
Incorrect.
Sure.
There is a parade. That's obviously a celebration.
Well, New York would. New York loves a parade, and they also have so many like different communities and ethnicities and nationalities of
do.
people there that they're like, yes, everybody, fuck yeah, get that parade.
So yeah, I ended up in a Scottish parade. It was very exciting, and that's why do you remember like the flags of Scotland that hung in my room over at our parents' house? They were like up under my book, like along the bookshelf.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's why I have them, because everyone's like, why do you have a flag of Scotland in here? I was like, why don't you? Obviously.
Yeah. I Ferris Buellered my way into a parade in New York City. I mean, and this is what I got for it.
In that parade, you would have seen lots of kilts, which they wouldn't have been wearing. Excuse me, they would not have been wearing in the 12th and 13th centuries. But there's no need to be disappointed, because by the time we get to where we are in the story now, you've still got another generation worth of non-stop fighting. So whilst we might not have been playing bagpipes or wearing kilts, we were just owning the fuck out of the battlefield where we could and playing the Game of Thrones like no one else. So. No need to be disappointed. We start getting hints of that in the movie because the English are getting pissed off because Scottish nobles are dying, which wasn't happening in real life, but resistance in Scotland did not cease. And this is the point of the movie where we get the princess returns. She is back in action and sent back to Wallace in order to warn him of the treachery that's away to befall him. Again, this is where the movie goes into its most spurious direction, which is William Wallace having an affair with the French princess Isabella, which definitely did not happen because she was still a French princess and 2 years old, and in France at this time. It absolutely categorically did not happen, although maybe you guys have some thoughts on that addition to the love story.
You had your love story. That was the whole point in the beginning.
I know. It just feels kind of cheap. Yeah. I'm much happier with like the fact that she likes the romance, the romantic story that her lady in waiting has told her, and it kind of like makes her a little more sympathetic to Wallace or the cause or whatever's going on, but then to like add in an actual physical relationship, and you're kind of like,
I feel like
we tried too hard here.
Yeah, like, I feel like if it was true, if his wife was killed, and that really pushed this whole, like, emotional, suddenly I have to free my country from the bonds of this other country, even though, like you said, with the whole feudal thing that you're going to be under someone anyway. I feel like if it was that emotionally devastating of a blow to this man, he wouldn't just willy-nilly waltz off with some French harlot. And I'm just saying, I don't think he would have dishonored her memory like that, dog. Yeah. Like, I mean, I could be wrong. I'm going to give William Wallace the benefit of the doubt here and say that I'm not, even though this never happened in real life, so I'm not giving him the benefit of the doubt for anything. But, everybody needs a good love story, and sometimes there are moments where I'm just going to decide if we're like, well, we don't know if it was real or not. I was like, sometimes I'm allowed to decide that joy is healthy too. That being said, listen, his wife died.
Is he not allowed to move on?
He is, but he wouldn't have, because his true love in life after that was freedom. Even though that doesn't...
Yeah, but freedom doesn't keep the bed warm. So...
he can get a dog.
Then
he won't be cold.
Not for the purpose I had in mind.
Well, no, not like that. He's going to have a vow of celibacy. He has to, because he has to fight in her dying memory. He's going to die anyway. Listen, all he had to live for was freedom at this point. So no woman. He's not allowed to move on. I disallow it.
You have just justified the entire story arc of Robert the Bruce in this movie.
I justified him?
Yeah, where you're like, England are going to win. They're really good at killing people. You're going to die, or ... term.
And he didn't have anything. He didn't have a lady die by the hands of the evil English. So
his wife is kidnapped.
His wife, yeah.
And daughter.
Oh, really?
And 3 of his brothers are executed. And when I say executed, they were hung, drawn, and quartered.
Yeah.
Like they were executed as traitors.
His wife.
His wife isn't returned to him until really, really late.
After Bannockburn. She's part of the
Oh, right. No, I see what you mean.
trade,
So,
the hostage trade.
but it's
I
a
want to
good
say
2
that.
years they're apart. Like, it's pretty brutal.
I'm missing a whole lot of history here. I'm just going to settle in and listen because there's much that I need to be told, obviously,
Yeah.
that I'm missing.
Outlaw King's
I don't
pretty
think-
good at showing that because that's a whole part of the story in that too.
So at which point in the movie are we then that you're describing?
So this is the point where Wallace has gone and killed all the Scottish nobles. Then the princess is essentially kind of sent to him. They meet. They have a very brief physical relationship. There's lots of longing looks from the princess afterwards, sort of wandering around, holding her belly because now she's pregnant. Yeah, and essentially Wallace is summoned to go and see Robert the Bruce, and he's told don't go because this is a trap. And Wallace essentially responds, "Yeah, he knows it's a trap. We've got to try. We can't do this alone." He says. He talks about his wife here, how he's fighting for Murren, his wife, or Marion in real life, or Blind Harry's telling the tale. He's still fighting for her, and as we remember from earlier in the movie, he told the Princess Isabella that he saw his wife's spirit in her. So even though he did move on, he did so with a person in whom he saw the spirit of his deceased wife, who also kind of tacitly blesses the union by appearing in a dream beforehand and stuff.
I suppose it's fair.
So this brings us to the betrayal scene. William Wallace rides to Edinburgh, not Roy Robston like it was in reality, and to a version of Edinburgh that looks nothing like Edinburgh Castle in any of its configurations. It's a very brief scene. Robert Bruce is finally on side, gives a little hopeful wave. Practically, we're expecting the scene from Rocky 3, where Rocky Balboa and Apollo Creed bound towards each other, frolicking through the water, and then engage in a very homoerotic hug. That's what we expect. Instead, we're denied the homoeroticism implied, and instead are just have betrayal shoved in our face one final time. But it's not Robert the Bruce who does the betraying this time. So what's happening in reality at this point? So this makes us at 1305.
Okay.
By 1305, Bruce's subservience to Edward I is now being suspected as a ruse by Edward. It's pretty clear that Robert the Bruce isn't really loyal to him and might never have been. We just don't know. And in 1305, that suspicion is confirmed by John Comyn, the other Guardian of Scotland who betrays Robert the Bruce. The very next year, so just jumping ahead a little bit, that's when Bruce kills John Comyn in a church. That is the inciting incident that leads to him being excommunicated by the Catholic Church, which was a big part of the Declaration of Arbroath some 15 years later to have that excommunication reversed. And that's also the year when Robert Bruce is finally crowned King of Scots, although it's some years before that becomes official, if you like. 1305, this is where William Wallace is captured and taken to England, and probably to the most accurate and horrifying part of the movie, which is his execution. If anything, the execution would have been more brutal in real life than is shown in the film.
Yeah, I thought it was a little bit toned down.
Yeah. I mean, he certainly was put on a show trial. He claimed he'd never sworn fealty to Edward I, so he couldn't be a traitor. Those arguments did not fall on receptive ears. Then, of course, we get another scene of fiction as we march towards the end. Who do you think will rule in his stead? The princess goads Edward I on his deathbed. Edward I survives for another 2 years. He doesn't die until 1307. And his daughter-in-law certainly wasn't pregnant by a Scots rebel. Again, 2 years. How old was she? Yeah, no, she would be about 4 years old by this point, I think. Still not married to Edward II, and still very much in France. But this is just some catharsis for the audience because in this movie, which is as much about ideas of masculinity as it is modern ideas about freedom, the burly man impregnates and fights and sexes his way to the ultimate moral victory, because that's what mid-90s movies were all about.
Yeah.
It gives me no pleasure to say that, by the way. Like screenwriters, and I know most of you are men, we can do better than this. And we are, but come on. So then we get the execution, which It's pretty gory. He's clearly getting disemboweled at one point. In reality, they would have burned his bowels in front of him whilst he was still alive. So he would have been hung, and if he went unconscious, he would have been revived. So we see that in the film. We see him getting stretched. He would have been disemboweled. He would also have been castrated.
I had a feeling that was left out. I was like, that seems a little tame for the English of this time.
Well, maybe he is. You just see his face reactions a lot of the time. He's still clutching the magic handkerchief his wife gave him, which periodically reappears in this movie with the picture of the thistle on it, and which somehow Robert the Bruce has in the next scene, holding the...
Doesn't it fall and one of the guys pick it up? Like Hamish or one of them, don't they pick it up when it falls from...
Quite possibly. I was too busy crying by this point. It gets a bit hazy for me at this point. There's a lot of tears.
It's a tough scene to watch.
It's an even tougher scene if you're from the Fairland.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we get the execution. The bowels, in reality, would have been burned in front of him. He certainly would have been castrated. And it's really pretty accurate, to be honest. The only thing that's not accurate is they would not have asked him to confess or beg for mercy, because that was not what that execution was about. That execution was about showing what happens to traitors. Mm-hmm. And that's why his body parts are sent to the four corners of the different kingdoms, two of which end up in Scotland, an arm and a leg, and I think in Perth and Stirling. And his head was put on a spike on London Bridge. So ends the story of William Wallace. Yourself, Laurel, pointed out at one point, I think, Braveheart's wasn't actually a nickname ever given to William Wallace. It was a name given to the star of the final scene of the movie.
Mm-hmm. Hamish. Carrying William Wallace's sword.
It was actually the horse that William Wallace rode, but anyway.
Yeah, final scene, the death of William Wallace. And here we are.
William Wallace is executed in 1305. After that, despite the effect that's meant to have, it does not quell Scotland. By 1305, Scotland has been conquered, but it does not stay conquered. And we're big time jump now. It's implied that this is the Battle of Bannockburn. It looks nothing like the Battle of Bannockburn. Robert the Bruce turns on the English after he's supposed to swear fealty to them. Utter nonsense. After 1305 and the murder of John Comyn, Robert the Bruce essentially declares himself king and then has his ass kicked in the Battle of Medon. He then goes on the run to the Highlands and the Islands, and gradually builds up support. And by the time he comes out of hiding, which would have been 1307, I think, around about the time of the death of Edward I, that's when the Scots flock to him. And he's a much better candidate to lead a unified, or much more unified national resistance against the English, because he's not just a low-born noble person with no reputation or real resources of his own. He is declared himself, more or less, King of Scotland. That kingship is confirmed in 1309 in a parliament held in St Andrews. And then a number of battles are fought, again against very significant odds, but slowly but surely the Bruce grinds the English down until he's laying siege to Stirling Castle, which is the last major English stronghold in Scotland. Not the last stronghold, but the last major one. And as we keep coming back to Stirling, it's the gateway to the Highlands, it's very central in Scotland. He's laying siege to it, and Edward II launches his invasion of Scotland again and summons up the largest army he could, the largest ever army to invade Scotland. And this is perhaps the most consequential of all the Scottish victories, because Scotland maybe had between, say 3,000 and 6,000 soldiers on the field at Bannockburn, whereas the English would have had between, say, 10,000 and 25,000. So really fighting against the odds. But and again, no hint of this in the movie, because Robert the Bruce has the magic handkerchief of thistle-like symbolism to guide his now brave heart. In reality, he trains his army to turn a defensive formation. I said this before, the Shiltron, into an offensive formation. And essentially what they do is they've just got these squares of men with long spears just grinding their way into the English. They're hemmed in with a burn, by the way, is a river, so Bannock River, right? Bannock Burn, the burn is behind them, so the English army can't manoeuvre, and the Scots just grind into them. And in battles, it doesn't matter how big your advantage is in terms of numbers. If your front line is only, say, 500 people strong, if you've got an army of 1,000 people, you've got 1,000 people fighting 500 at any one time, so you've got 2-to-1 odds. So the Scots grind them down. The English army is in disarray, basically, by this point. In fact, you know what? I skipped a day. Let me just skip back a second, right? Let me tell you, this is an even cooler story. The day before the main battle of Bannockburn, Robert the Bruce goes out with some of his knights on a reconnaissance mission, right? And he's spotted by a guy called Hugh de Bohun, Henry de Bohun. Okay.
Huge de Bohun.
Huge de Bohun. Well, not for much longer.
Get the fuck out now.
Henry de Bohun. Henry de Bohun. I'm pretty sure I said Hugh.
Yeah, huge.
You did.
Huge de Bohun.
Well, not huge enough, as it turns out. Because, Henry de Bohun attacks, or there's two stories. Basically, he sees Robert the Bruce, and Robert the Bruce isn't ready for war. He's on a lightly armoured horse, he's lightly armoured himself, and he only has an axe. He's just on a reconnaissance mission, and he spots him or the other Scots knights and decides to ambush them. He goes into the woods after the Bruce. The Bruce spots him, they charge each other, and once they collide, Robert the Bruce swings his axe and decimates de Bohun's head, completely collapses it. The other version of the story is that de Bohun goes into the woods, thinks maybe this is a dangerous spot for me to be, turns around and tries to ride away, and then Robert the Bruce comes at him and also collapses his head with his battle axe. That decimates the morale in the English army. So you jump ahead to the next day, which I was just telling you about. The English army has low morale. And the reason the Bruce attacks on this day is because a Scottish defector, someone who is following Edward II, defects back to the Scots, tells him, look, morale's really low in the camp. You killed Henry de Bohun. You really kind of kicked ass there. Again, no kilts, Katie, but we do have like horse chargers, battle axes, and crushed skulls. Like, we know how to bring it where it counts, when it counts. Okay.
I'll say it'll do. It'll do.
That's when we put the kilts on to show off our also fabulous legs. We had to compensate for it. You see.
There you go.
So the English army gets with the river, the Bannockburn behind them. They get hemmed in, and these Shiltrons just grind their way into the English, and their morale's already low, and they break. The Scottish cavalry, the knights barely do anything in that battle. And normally when you think about medieval battles, it's all about the knights. The knights in this battle are relatively few in number, and all they do, and this is an important job, is they scatter the English longbowmen. So they just break the English apart. Eventually, the English army collapses, it's routed, it flees in disarray, and the Scottish forces pursue them. And they pursue them all the way back to the English border, basically. Edward II is present in this battle, and at one point, one of his knights realises, we've lost this, takes his king's horse by the rein and forces Edward II to leave the field to protect his safety. So
he wasn't a total coward.
Not a total coward, no.
No,
but then he
had to be told to
immediately
leave.
Go to the west coast and get on a boat that sails him all the way back down to London. So that's how bad of a defeat this was. The Scots pursue the English to the north of England. Robert the Bruce consolidates his power and then begins to launch attacks into England, and sent his surviving brother, Edward Bruce, with an army into Ireland to attack the English there, and to delegitimise the assumption that the Plantagenets had that they were overlords of all of the British Isles. So ultimately, by the time you get to 1320, the Declaration of Arbroath, the Scots are fighting, or have been fighting in Ireland, and been fighting in Northern England, and the centre of gravity of this war has finally swung away from Scotland itself. And this puts so much pressure on Edward II, he essentially has to concede and recognise Scottish independence, which isn't officially recognised until 1328 with the Treaty of, I think it's Northampton, Edinburgh, Northampton. That's where they finally recognise Scotland as an independent nation.
Wow.
Dude, he was not having it. He even went to Ireland to prove his point. I respect that.
I respect that too.
Yeah. So Robert Bruce, a complex character, certainly more complex than portrayed in this film. Does turn cold for sure, but when he turns back, boy, does he turn back. So the character I see in this movie doesn't really reflect the historic individual who Robert I really was. And that is how Braveheart could have ended or had a sequel, but never did. In fact, like Laurel said, Robert the Bruce is, the phrase Braveheart is associated with him because when he died, he asked that his heart be cut out and carried into the Crusades, where one of his friends and allies threw it ahead of himself in battle, saying something to the effect of, "Proceed on, ye Braveheart, I, Douglas, will follow you." Isn't that a cool ending for a movie?
Did he actually do that?
We have no idea. Medieval writers tend to exaggerate, right? I mean, maybe. Sounds cool.
Heart grenade.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not convinced he was particularly effective in that battle.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to agree with you on that one.
I'd say it's unlikely that he did that, but I mean, lots of people did lots of really crazy to us looking symbolic gestures on battlefields. So is it beyond the realms of imagination? No. And Robert the Bruce,
I guess whatever keeps morale up, but I feel like throwing the heart would for me, I'd be like, well, why did you throw that out? Wasn't that the symbol of that we were rallying around? You'd just be like, nah, just throw it. I'd be like, what the fuck?
You first.
What the hell?
Well, one of the things that gets Robert the Bruce excommunicated and essentially peace is essentially his promise that Scotland will send soldiers to fight in the Crusade at the time. So, there's a few layers kind of to it, if that makes sense. There's a lot going on there. So it is a bit of a silly story, but it's not really beyond the realms of imagination. It's not necessarily probable, but it is possible. And I can imagine his heart being taken there. That feels kind of important. And that's one of the themes that's kind of poorly expressed in this film, and they try to touch on it, is Christianity and the importance of it. William Wallace does kind of casually talk about God quite a lot and God's will. But for many of the people at this time, God wasn't a possibility. God was very, very real. Mm-hmm. And the power of the church, incredibly important. In fact, it's the Bishop of Glasgow, I think, who kind of not necessarily blesses, but legitimizes Wallace and his followers, not just as outlaws and brigands, but as legitimate fighters for freedom of the country. It was a huge deal. And that's why in 1320, when Scotland's Declaration of Independence, this letter's written to the Pope called the Declaration of Arbroath. It's written by the abbot who was Chancellor of Scotland, I think, at the time. These are really important people. In fact, let me give you a little fun fact. Okay, so in the modern world, right, the class system, we think about the upper class, the rich, the super rich, then you've got the middle class, and then you've got the working class. That's the three-tier system. In the medieval world, the top class was the priesthood, because they're the ones who are praying for your soul. And there's a very real chance you're going to end up in hell unless people are praying for you to get out of purgatory and so on and so forth. And even if you're not going to hell, you're going to certainly be in purgatory for a long time. So the priesthood are like this buffer between the rest of humanity and God, or the saints, or whoever. And remember, most people at this time haven't ever heard the Bible read to them in their own language. It's read to them in Latin, so they don't actually understand what's being said. And there's a lot of ritual around it and so on and so forth. So the priesthood are actually the upper class. Then you've got the nobility, which is a tiny slither of society, tiny. And then you've got everyone else. So the peasants aren't just the poorest of the poor. That's merchants and people like this. So you can be a wealthy peasant and a poor noble, for example. So class isn't based upon economic standing. It's based upon this other type of structure. So when you go to Bernard of Arbroath, for example, the Abbot of Arbroath, the Chancellor of Scotland, when they prepare this really big declaration that declares their freedom. Well, number one, he would have been able to write and to read, which would have been a rarity amongst most people at this time. That certainly wasn't common. And he was also a man, he was a person of the cloth. Yeah, so the Declaration of Arbroath is essentially written on April 6th. The barons of Scotland and a few earls as well put their seal to it, and then sent off to the Pope. There's 3 copies of the letter made. I think only one continues to still exist now, and it's in a very sort of gentle way. But there is one part of it that does stir our souls a little bit, and we're very proud of in my time. And it goes like this: "For as long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom. For that alone which no honest man gives up, but with life itself." And that brings an end to the historical coda to Braveheart.
Laurel, where's your sword? You're supposed to be grabbing your sword, yelling, "Freedom!"
I gotta pull it into frame here. It's too big. It's too big. Chink, that's me, just chink right down to the ground. Episode 100 is in the books. There it is. How do we feel? What's the love meter overall on Braveheart? Is it something that, I know we talked a little bit about that before we went into the movie, but is it something that you guys are like, wow, this is a good movie, I like it? Or after learning more about the real history, are you like,
I assume you're asking. Are you asking on behalf of Scotland, or are you asking us as people?
I'm gonna ask you guys as people. Katie, do you have a thought process on that?
I mean, this pretty much destroyed Braveheart for me, but
okay.
Is that because you felt it was like historically accurate before?
I knew, so going into it, I remember I was sick on the couch watching it on one of the movie channels one day, as you do. Laurel knows what I'm talking about. Do you know how much Divorce Court I watched on my sick days? So much. Anyway, I knew I had Googled that the princess wasn't there. She was young and in France at that time. I said, okay, that's bullshit. And then what was the other thing? There was one other thing I knew. I think basically I had known that they really compiled it into less of a passage of time versus how long it actually went on. I think those are the only 2 things I knew about historical accuracy as far as this movie. So to describe this as eye-opening, yes. Soul-altering a little bit, yes, because... But, you know, what might have saved it was that poem. So, you know...
Well, consider this, right? Think about all that you've learned about the medieval period in this discussion, right? All the things you didn't know before. Then ask yourself, how unlikely is it that you get someone like William Wallace to emerge in that? Who, granted, is a minor noble, but still very much a sort of a grassroots activist.
Mm-hmm.
And is fighting for something that's larger than himself.
Yeah.
Right? And he never turns cold.
Nope.
Right? There's never any question about that. He's fighting for whatever reasons he's fighting for. We don't know if he was married, probably at some point. It wouldn't be unusual. He got to his middle ages, right?
It probably was. We're going to pretend he was handsome. I don't know what he looked like, but he probably was a decent looker.
I'm sure if he was married, his wife appreciated him, and I think that's what matters. But at the end of the day, you're living in a very hierarchical society, and there were people in Scotland who were willing to break out of that. And the fight wasn't necessarily about taking power for themselves. And there was, you get, in reality, the odds against the Scots were much greater than they're depicted in this movie. Like, they talk about them fighting impossible odds, but they don't really show it.
Mm-hmm.
They don't show how the string of defeats that punctuated these victories. And in some respects, if you think about what the medieval world was really like, the story, the heart of the story, the seed of truth, is all the more remarkable as a result. Yes, it lacks our modern thought processes about freedom or liberty, right? Yes, it's more complex and problematic and less relatable. But the individuals who we're talking about are in some respects even more remarkable because of that they are so relatable to us now. And, Wallace is kind of forgotten about in Scotland for a couple of centuries. It's not someone that's really talked about or anything like that. And he's rediscovered in the Scottish Enlightenment in the 18th century. Robert Burns, who's like our William Shakespeare. He writes poems about him. Walter Scott, our kind of poet laureate, for want of a better way of putting it, really puts him back in the public consciousness in a big way. And the story of that as Scotland as a nation changes and evolves and grows and matures. That's a part of our history we reconnect to as we sort of drift away from, or parts of ourselves reject or deal with the complex and contradictory issue that is being part of a political union with the rest of the United Kingdom. Mm-hmm. So yes, it's disappointing, but it's also, I put it to you, knowing the context and saying, it doesn't matter if they played bagpipes or wore kilts back then. What matters is there was this kind of, not exactly a peasants' rebellion, but certainly a rebellion that was about much more than just serving one king, regardless of the potential for profit for oneself.
I will say, though, that was the other thing. I'm glad you touched on it, but that I was just going to say is I have a lot more respect for William Wallace now because, like you said, the odds were even more stacked against him at that. When you said that, especially the point where you made that the fact that modern people, the idea, like you said, the self-evident truth of liberty and the freedom and stuff is not something that would have existed for them, makes it even more impressive that a man like that could even garner a following, especially when the nobles didn't care much for the common peoples. They didn't have much in common, like you were saying. It would just woof. Woof for Wallace, man. Woof for Wallace.
So my feelings about Braveheart, it's a really fun film. Can't wait to watch it with my kids. As a piece of history, it's not very good, but it doesn't need to be very good because perhaps, even with all the lies that it tells, perhaps because of the lies that it tells, there's some more essential truth at the heart of that, maybe, which I really appreciate. Laura, what did you think about Braveheart?
I've always liked Braveheart. I liked it when I saw it as a kid. I liked it now in my more recent viewings of it. It's fun. When you got a few, like 3 spare hours to sit and watch a movie, that's what you do. So your viewings of it aren't very frequent, but I enjoyed the movie. I knew that there was some historical inaccuracies in it. It's really great now to know the greater history there, though. And I don't really think that either takes away from the other, for me personally. It's, like there's that saying, like stranger than fiction, or like things like that. I think that the real history is even greater than the historical fiction that's been written here for Braveheart. And there's like a lot of really amazing complexities and relationships. And again, hey, folks, I don't like going as an episode without being able to pull out my historical tapestry. When we get to look at the whole, there we go. I put it across my castle wall. There it is. So when we see the big picture of something and see all the different moving parts that are going on, it really adds to a greater understanding of the movie. You can appreciate any movie, really, in this case, but you can really fully appreciate it, really understand what's going on. You feel more connected to it, I think, in some ways then, when you can really understand all the different moving parts, as well as socially what's going on, what else is happening in history that can add to what's going on in a movie. So yeah, I love it. So thank you for bringing the real history to it all. And folks, if you are a member of the Best Buds Club over on Patreon, we're going to have an interview up in a few days with Dr. Reid about being from Arbroath, where the Declaration of Arbroath was signed. There's a lot of history there. It's really great having you back as a guest, and then not only as a guest again, but for our special episode 100. So thank you very much, Dr. Darren Reid, for joining us today. Thank all of you for being here, whether it be your first episode today or you have listened to all 100 episodes. Thank you so much for being a member of our Smoke Circle. And we have 2 more episodes left for season 5, and that will conclude our current season. So we'll see you again in a couple of weeks. In the meantime, get money, get high, give love, and
freedom. Freedom, everyone. Freedom. If there's one overarching, huh?
I cried historical accuracy. That's my
historical accuracy.
I saw like freedom on 3. 1, 2, 3. For historical accuracy. Oh. Bye, everybody. Bye.
Bye now.